All right, good evening, everyone. It's 7:10 p.m. on June 6th. Can you believe it? June 6th, one of the most gorgeous days we've had in who knows how long. At least since yesterday. June regular meeting of the Norbert Planning Commission, convened in Borough Hall's big room to take advantage of the air conditioning, which does not exist in the council chambers. Tonight, we have an agenda which is focused largely on a review of the current draft of the subdivision and land development ordinance. We do have two brief items on the agenda. One is update on the Station Circle Town Square project. Dave, we are really eager to know whether we have a circle or a square. And also, hopefully a very brief discussion and potentially recommendation on the regulated uses ordinance zoning amendment, which has been proposed by Borough Council. That is our agenda tonight. So let me start by thanking everyone for being here and noting that all planning commissioners are present in person, except for Jim Cornwell, who, if you did not hear, is a new grandfather. Grandfather again, grandfather once removed, twice removed. Proudest guy in the world, I can bet you that.
Population of Norbert keeps growing.
And I made one promise to Jim, is that we would work hard to make a world that is deserving of receiving his new granddaughter. So that's our job tonight. So Jim, if you're tuned in or watching on tape, good luck to you and your family, and congratulations. Also with us are Eric Johnson, Borough Engineer, Chloe Moore, Borough Planning Consultant from the Montgomery County Planning Commission. Online, we have Kevin Walsh, Borough Zoning Officer, I believe one member of the public. Is that correct? Ira. Council Member Ira Winston. So that is who's in attendance tonight. We'll begin with the chair's update, which is brief because we're going to hear the most important updates from Dave Brower, and I already told you about Jim Cornwell. The only update is several of us have been continuing informal conversations with the applicant for Price House on Montgomery Avenue, who will be submitting a revised proposal for that project sometime in the near future. I believe that's really the only news I have to share. Anyone else have any announcements or updates or information you'd like to share?
Did you have a meeting about 146 Marion? Or is that something?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Thank you for reminding me. We also have met with the applicants for 146 Marion, who also will be submitting a new application, which will involve construction of 2 units as a twin, 2 cottages, and the moving of their house. Subdivided into five lots. So I expect, and they're interested in moving very quickly. They'll be talking with the borough solicitor about different ways of potentially skipping a step. I don't know what that could entail, but they'll be in probably in July as well. So two big land developments process. Thanks for reminding me of that.
Did you say they're going to subdivide the lot?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So the proposal is to subdivide into 5 individual lots. 2 of them will have twins, 2 of them will have cottages, and 1 will have the existing house, which will be moved from one side of the lot to the other. Is there a proposal? And they are, they're taking advantage of the new infill ordinance that was just approved by council. So anyone else have any announcements, updates, clarifications? Okay, I'll ask Dave Brower if you can give a report on behalf of you, Jim, all of us, the community, on the Station Circle Town Square process.
A brief report. I can't tell you if it's a circle or a square. Yeah.
Oh, so after all that,
there was intriguing discussion about a hexagon, but we won't go into it. No, we had a kickoff Zoom meeting with the Simone Collins team, which I thought was productive. We touched on many points. they outlined their work effort. If I got it correctly, I believe now that Samantha is in the process of setting up meetings with the stakeholders who have been identified. And I have not heard anything about specific times and dates, so I assume that that's still in process, but that's the first step, is to get those meetings with the major stakeholders, including but not necessarily entire list is SEPTA and Amtrak, the Business Association, and not thinking of any others. But we expect that to happen shortly and to move along to meet the schedule that was talked about to have the work effort wrapped up sometime, I believe, in the fall. That's my report.
All right. Any questions for Dave? What do you think the overwhelming goal, desire, hope from the community is that you heard through this process?
Well, I think based on what we saw in the charrette and backed up with any other anecdotal comments, is to have a largely traffic-free, pedestrian-friendly civic space that is green and is amenable to various public activities, and to keep the cars of necessary intrusion of vehicular traffic to an absolute minimum. I think there was also, I assume, fairly universal desire to have some kind of a traffic calming way of making the zone from the corner of Forest Avenue to Essex Avenue a slower traffic area that was more geared to pedestrian activity and less to vehicular activity.
I also heard the landscape architect talk about they would be happy to take any calls or communication from Norbert public. Is that true, or are you recommending they go to the borough?
Well, they certainly gave out a message of wanting to be amenable
and accessible.
Accessible. I think for sanity's sake, I think there should be a point person on the committee that channels that to the design team, so they don't just get random calls out of nowhere and they don't know who they're talking to. So I think we should set up a procedure. I would think presumably the contact person should be Samantha. And if somebody from the public has a comment to the design team, that they go through Samantha. I just know from personal experience of working on projects that you have to get a random call in an office and you don't know who the person is or why they're calling is or can be disconcerting and counterproductive. And that it really should be funneled through the committee.
Okay, well, thank you. And thanks to you, Jim, and all the other planning commissioners who helped with that effort. And we'll see what happens. All right, the next item on our agenda then, the first business item, is the Advertised Regulated Uses Ordinance. We've reviewed this once before. We generally supported this ordinance, recommended support of it. We recommended that council consider some further recommendations that Montgomery County Planning Commission made. particularly in regard to hours of operation, buffers, conditional use, several other kind of features of these uses. Regulated uses ordinance in general creates a new class of land uses in the borough called regulated uses. And those are defined in the proposed zoning amendment as bail bond agencies, check cashing businesses, gun shops, hookah bars, pawn shops, payday lenders, shooting ranges, smoke shops, tattoo parlor, any store or restaurant that sells or offers products containing THC or kratom, I don't even know what that is, and any business that permits or sanctions off-track betting or gambling on horse racing outside a racetrack, off-track betting. Furthermore, it restricts those uses or permits them only in the 5B Montgomery Avenue district. Furthermore, it defines automobile uses, which it, I believe, am I correct, Chloe, it limits that to the 5B district as well?
Yeah.
Furthermore, it creates the provision that adult uses and marijuana dispensaries, which interestingly are not cross-referenced in the definition of regulated uses, Chloe. But it does say marijuana dispensaries and adult uses are only permitted by special exception in the 5B zoning district. Furthermore, it limits or creates 4 special exceptions for adult uses criteria that include that an adult use must be 500 feet from a school, place of worship, a park, child care center, or nursery school. So the kind of distance relationship. So I think that this is primarily the ordinance that we saw before. Council chose to incorporate some, but I'm not sure, Chloe, if it included all of the recommendations or at least the ideas that NCPC offered about how the ordinance could be strengthened. MCPC issued a letter of review in which it recommended approval of the zoning text amendment. I don't believe you had any further recommendations for revisions. So I believe that is the nature of this zoning amendment. I'd like to ask Chloe if there's anything I said that you'd like to clarify or correct, because you might have read this more carefully. And secondly, is there anything from your previous letter of your comments that Borough Council did not follow through on that you feel is worth flagging for us or is of concern to you?
Yeah, thanks. I think in general, this revision addressed our concerns, and that the list of possible things you might want to consider in terms of additional regulations for adult uses was more like a menu of options rather than something we'd recommend every single thing being included. So some kind of additional layer of review or protection was what we recommended, and that is covered here. The only remaining concern is just to be sure that your solicitor is comfortable with any additional restrictions on the marijuana dispensary. It's such a new use in Pennsylvania, and the state enabling legislation related to medical marijuana. I put a quote in the first letter that says, this is directly from the Medical Marijuana Act from the state of Pennsylvania. It says, a dispensary shall meet the same municipal zoning and land use requirement as other commercial facilities that are located in the same zoning district. And some solicitors have interpreted that as you can't have stricter requirements on a dispensary than other similar types of commercial facilities in the same zoning district. If your solicitor is comfortable with this, we're fine with it. Just wanted to mention that, so we've been part of those discussions in a number of municipalities. Oh, what do we do about this medical marijuana use, and exactly how much can we regulate it or should we regulate it? And I think this is, I mean, it's fine. It's just a special exception requirement. It's not, it's not some really strict
So we are being asked tonight to make our recommendation to council. Does anyone on the commission have any questions about this ordinance, clarifications, or comments that you'd like to make? Any questions, comments? Is anyone prepared then to make a motion about a recommendation to council related to this ordinance, proposed ordinance?
I'd like to make a recommendation that we agree to present the proposed ordinance to council for passing.
So we would recommend that council approve it?
Yeah.
Okay. So we have a motion that the commission would recommend that Borough Council approve this proposed ordinance. Is there a second for that?
Second.
Dave Brower, seconds. Any further conversation or discussion or questions? Okay. All in favor of recommending to council that they approve this ordinance, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, so we unanimously recommend council approve this ordinance. Okay. Before we move on to the saldo, I neglected to mention to you, Adam has submitted minutes from last month's meeting. He submitted them today.
Late. They were late.
They were submitted today. I haven't had a chance to review them, and I don't expect anyone here has either. So I'll flag that for you and ask if you can review them before the next meeting, so that we can approve them next meeting. But I do thank you, Adam. I know how hard it is to keep these things going, having done it for a while, so I'm glad you did it. Okay, so let's move on then to the main order of business tonight, which is the subdivision and land development ordinance, which we've talked with Chloe. So Chloe, Eric, Michelle, Carol, I believe it's fair to say you have been the point people on reviews. Is Michelle with us tonight? Is she?
I think so.
I think she's
Yes,
there.
I'm here.
Oh, good evening. We didn't acknowledge you earlier.
Kevin Walsh has also been involved.
Yeah, I remember
Helpful.
we noted. And so the staff, Kevin, Eric, Michelle, and Chloe have been taking the lead on this. We've seen iterations of different parts of this. We've commented a lot on the submission requirements and processing. We've had some discussions about the design, but I think this is the first time, I guess late April, about 5 or 6 weeks ago, that we received the whole, as they say, kit and caboodle, the whole draft, which we are now to look at in its entirety and review and comment on. I will say that most of the people I talk to in the borough office or who are elected say, when's that going to be done? But I think that we should look at this carefully. There are some things in this draft that are new that we've never seen before and at least merit discussion. So last week, Michelle and Chloe and I went through this. I know I had made a lot of notes on it. We tried to prioritize the topics that we should focus on. So I sent you a hint about that over the weekend or this morning. Chloe sent a better list in the middle of the day. So I'd like to work from that list. If there are other issues or topics in the SADA that you would like to flag, we can add them to the list, but I'd like to go through the list as we've outlined it. Also, a lot of these topics are still super complicated. A lot of them involve the interaction between saldo and stormwater or zoning. And so I think that part of our conversation today is simply to ask for explanations. So I know that we've relayed that to Chloe as a starting point for some of these topics, which is to really understand the dynamics between the different parts of the code, how they interact, and what's happening in the saldo in relation to the other codes. That's part of what we hope to do today. So unless there's any further prefacing of this from Chloe or Eric or Michelle, I think we should get started. And so in a particular order, A through F in group 1, well, let me just review the topics quickly. The first one is stormwater. And here we will really want Eric's help in understanding the interplay between the stormwater provisions of this code and our stormwater code. I hope within the umbrella of stormwater, I've used that word largely, but I think it also includes wetlands, which are kind of in the same area of the Saldo. The second topic is to review the order of operations when an application comes in, particularly in terms of how it's referred to different boards and commissions, and specifically what the relationship of us reviewing an application and the HARB reviewing an application might be. Third topic, mobile home parks, completely out of the blue, a new topic for us to look at, so we'll understand why it's there and what our options are. Fourth topic is back to the conversation about sidewalks and planting strips. Another fifth topic is something new that's been added, transportation impact studies. You know, we had a little experience talking about transportation impacts when it came to 3 Elmwood. So this is sort of outlines a process of dealing with that. And then the sixth major topic is coordination with the zoning ordinance. So we'll see how far we get, and then there are some smaller, hopefully less complicated topics after that if we have time. So let's start with stormwater. And Eric, welcome as always. Could you start by explaining to us what is in the stormwater and wetlands provisions of the Saldo and how it relates particularly to the stormwater ordinance? I think maybe some of the things might also relate to the landscape ordinance, I'm not sure, but can you give us a picture of all that, please?
Yeah, so let's just start with, I'll give a quick broad overview. So the provisions of your borough code that have to do with stormwater, you have the section which is chapter 441, stormwater management, which is the traditional section everyone's familiar with. There's these provisions that have to do with stormwater that are currently in this draft Saldo. And kind of just a good way to think of them. So the stormwater code itself is really, has been developed and it's based on the statewide stormwater management regulations, the borough's stormwater discharge permit. And what that section really focuses on is the protection of surface water and groundwater, and to a great extent, trying to undo a lot of the past sins of the way we used to manage stormwater. It used to be put a storm sewer in, dump the water away from a property as fast as you can. The stormwater ordinance now regulates stormwater like on a particular property with regard to infiltration, so it requires you to infiltrate water on that property. With peak rate, it requires that you keep you don't discharge water too fast off the property, so it slows at how fast it gets to the streams. And all of that helps with stream bank stabilization, it helps with ENS, and just generally helps the overall watershed. So that's, in a nutshell, what's regulated in there. The section, this code language, which you see in the model ordinance right now, is a lot of the nuts and bolts of how the broader stormwater stormwater design on a site or as part of a development would be.
Eric, when you say model ordinance, are you now referring to
the model? Yes. So what I just described is what's currently in that stormwater ordinance, chapter 441 of your current code. The model ordinance I'm referring to now is this current Saldo document that's in front of you. So in there, it has various requirements that have to do with, protection. When you're looking at a piece of property, what areas of the property have to be protected, what portions of sensitive areas can be disturbed. And when I say sensitive areas, that's wetlands, forest. It's also steep slopes, which is something the current code does not really have any protection against steep slopes. So it really parses down what's protected on a property. It walks through the various standards of how a wetland on a property is delineated, how the buffers are established, and then it goes into some of the technical requirements, so the technical standards of your stormwater pipe sizing, inlet sizing, a lot of just infrastructure that goes into a development. And then that's all in part 4, which is the engineering technical standards of that model saldo. And then there's one other little section, which is in the special reports, which is really kind of a procedural section that just kind of ties in the requirement to submit, as part of a land development, a standalone stormwater report that compiles all the various information together. So that's kind of a brief overview. Now, one distinction is here is, well, you have stuff in stormwater code, and there's the stuff that's in this model saldo. The question is, well, why is it not all in the stormwater code? The answer is not really a clear answer on that. Some people have everything in the stormwater code. Some people have items broken out in this. That standalone stormwater section is very, as it is now, is very based off of the model stormwater code of the entire state that everyone's following. And then some people add additional sections onto that, and other municipalities have it in the standalone saldo section, which the borough's previous ordinance did not really have a great stormwater section than when it in the saldo. So that's how we've ended up here. We've built up that code with more of the provisions at this point. So.
Before we have questions or conversation, could you also discuss how, for me, sometimes it's hard to separate out things about stormwater from things about riparian corridors, because we've dealt with 3 on 1. It was not the same thing. So can you also describe the riparian corridor standards in the SADO, and again, how they interact or relate to other ordinances?
Right. So, in general,
I'm sorry, and wetlands, riparian corridor and wetlands. There's 2.
Right. Well, they all kind of go together. So, when you have a water body, and this goes up to the state level of regulation. When you have a waterway, that waterway is protected by default, and the code, even in the existing stormwater code, it calls out the provisions of buffers that must be established. And in this case, it would be from the center line of the stream, it's 50 feet to either side of the stream. It has to be is a protected area that is not allowed to be encroached on with development. So that's how you get required development to be separated from that. And that's the minimum standard. You just can't build any closer to that point, and it's supposed to be maintained as a sensitive area. This model code, as it is now, is actually going a step beyond that, and then it's laying out procedures of how that buffer could actually be improved. Because by default, it's just you can't touch it. But it also, this model code has some language in it of how, well, that actually could be improved. You could put better vegetation in there and better manage it than it currently is. And then kind of concurrent with that, you have wetlands. So by default, as is regulated up to the state, wetlands are protected areas. So anytime you suspect that there is a habitat that may be a wetland, you have to do a wetland study, or that the property owner has to do a wetland study, whoever's trying to work on that. And it's kind of the same thing. That area does not necessarily correspond directly with the center line of the stream. It's wherever the wetland is, it becomes a protected area. And the intention is to maintain the area. You can't develop in it, can't infringe upon it, can't degrade it. So that's really kind of the element of that.
Is there a way that you can, is there a way? I guess then it would be useful for us to understand what is in this ordinance that is different from what we have now. How does this code change the rules that we are operating with at the moment?
Change the rules. I guess this probably, came a lot out of the discussions over 3 Elmwood. is that established we knew you had to maintain the buffer away. You can't develop within a riparian area. Through those discussions we had gone through, and there's proposed plans that had come up with how they could improve that, should they improve it, what would go in there. This code now has some language in it, which is still open for discussion, but of how a plan could be presented to improve that area instead of just requiring it to be a don't touch type of area, which is the minimal standard required by the statewide stormwater ordinance. And to say, when I say it's protected by the state, I mean once you start trying to work or modifying a stream or working within that area, then you're going into PADEP level regulation and permitting. So that's really it goes beyond the borough once you start impacting a waterway of the Commonwealth.
So riparian corridors, doesn't it also increase the buffer distance from 10 to 50 feet?
So I believe it says it's 50 feet in maybe correct me if I'm wrong, the previous code I think had some language that allowed reductions in certain forms.
I don't have the.
I believe the previous code was just 10 feet.
Right. Well, I think that might have been, it may even been the SALDA might have said one number, and the stormwater code might have said one. I know the standalone stormwater code has a 50-foot in it. I believe the current SALDA, I have to double check, but I think it has language talking about when you have in various cases where it can modify that that depth.
Well, I think in practicality, 3 Elmwood just had 10 feet. I think that was.
That was noted on there. I do know. Actually, I was just checking it today. And I forget if it was the interaction of where the floodplain was on there or not. But the closest improvement on that property was 51 feet from the stream.
Okay, so I'm mistaken.
But that could have it because the floodplain was also interacting on that one.
Right, in terms of the distance.
At the distance that they could even go with in any case, yeah.
I'll confess, I don't even know if we have a wetlands section in our current SALDO. Is that something new, or is that something modified, or?
Don't know if they have existing code. I don't know if it had much of a wetlands section.
I have to double check.
And it may
have a section called wetlands.
Yeah, I don't know that it really had a clear section. There's also almost, and maybe it never really came up either because there's not really anywhere in the borough that had been, that 3 Elmwood found pretty much the property that had grass next to a stream except for Norbert Park.
Okay. Now I know I had sent a number of very specific questions about this section, but I think it's better to stop and ask if anyone else has questions about these sections, what they are, how they interact, what they say, what they do. Does anyone else have any questions?
I mean, I have a question. Can I?
Please.
I have a question just about sort of cross-coordination with other information that's currently out there. For example, on the Norbert sustainability webpage, they have some updated info as of March 2022. And I just have it noted here, so I'm sorry if it's a little sketchy, but is there a new stormwater master plan, or is there just a new focus on bump outs? There's a note saying under stormwater for the Norbert sustainability webpage that give me a sec. Norbert Borough has a dedicated webpage for stormwater management and has received notice to proceed from Montgomery County for stormwater bump outs. The borough engineer expects to have the design ready for bid in June 2022. Is this something kind of like running parallel to SALDO revisions, or?
No, that is actually just another project the borough that we have undergoing right now. The borough got grant funding last year, or a few months ago, to implement some stormwater bump out project. And that's independent of the stormwater code. That's just a project that we got funding for, and that project will help the borough towards its MS4 pollutant reduction plan requirements.
Okay.
That's actually kind of a byproduct of the stormwater regulations. That's a project the borough is undertaking. Yeah.
Yeah. Are these bump outs, they act as diverters?
So that the intention there is that you're collecting, that's to help with pollution, sediment reduction. So that's taking water run down the street, you filter it before it gets. Yeah. But that is a product, as a byproduct of all the stormwater regulations in practice.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's the type of things that you're looking for on type of development. That's called a BMP. That any type of development would be required to do.
Anyone else? All right, well, Eric, I sent to Chloe a number of specific questions. I hope they made them to you.
Yeah, you're marked up draft, yeah.
So I don't want to take up the whole night on stormwater, so I don't know what the right way to do this is. Would it be, should we just go down them one by one and see how much time it takes, and then Chloe, maybe we, at some point move on to other topics, or I'm not sure.
Right on your list.
Well, I attempted to fish out a few that I thought would be more beneficial for group discussion if we wanted to go into those.
Let's do that then. And folks, we're referring to section 113.47, stormwater management and drainage, if you'd like to follow along. Chloe, why don't you?
Also known as 45057.
What's that?
The latest draft number is it's actually section 45057.
Well, 450.57. All right then.
It's
Depending what version you're looking at.
right.
Okay.
Although the first one that I noted was actually in the topsoil protection and grading section, 450.53, which it's okay if you don't know it, but Todd asked specifically about drainage onto neighboring properties, which is an issue that in my experience comes up a lot. And the specific language around it, but the question was about how does this relate to other types of things in the code about drainage and what's allowed to drain onto a neighbor's property and how that works.
Yeah, so I can so that's actually the code section that I love because it allows me to comment a lot on stuff. It's a very broad top statement. So the intention.
Can you read the section of the code though that you're referring to?
It's in the grade. It's
here.
Topsoil and grading is the full section. So.
Additional water caused by subdivision or land development shall not drain directly onto an adjoining property without the express written consent of the adjoining property owner. Whenever any person grades, paves, disturbs, or modifies the natural land or subsurface flow of stormwater, plans shall be submitted to and approved by the borough engineer.
Right. That language is actually something that comes all the way down from like the state stormwater regulation. So the recognition is stormwater always flows downhill, flows across properties, always has, always will. However, when you're doing development under our current stormwater code, where we now regulate infiltration and peak rate, is anytime something is built now, the rate of stormwater coming off that property cannot be increased. That's why we put in basins, put in BMPs to control that. What this provision is ensuring is either through putting new development on or regrading the property, you're not redirecting and increasing stormwater onto someone else's property. And that's one of those things that we review on a regular basis to ensure we're not changing or worsening the situation for anybody on an abutting property. So really, I guess to answer the question, that section directly is involved with and the reason we have the rate reduction and all the stormwater requirements. So it does tie directly in to the stormwater ordinance.
Right. Now this, I think we're familiar with this. The catch here is it's additional water, and most calculations demonstrate that whatever techniques they're using, they will maintain or reduce the overall amount of.
Correct, and you might have someone, let's say you're putting in a house and you have a basin and you're collecting the water, that's all well and good. But if over here on the other side of your property, you're like regrading a swale towards someone's yard, that's still gonna be a problem.
Right.
So.
But what I think the catch here is that since this is in the subdivision and land development ordinance, this only applies to properties that are going through land development or subdivision. So remember the property we had on Dudley, 230 Dudley, where they were subdividing? Mm-hmm. They had future plans to build a house, and they voluntarily agreed to follow.
So he actually, so actually I've been reviewing the grade permit right now, they just resubmitted it. They actually met the requirement, they had to meet stormwater because of the newer replacement impervious on that property. And it's actually, one of those comments is, one of the comments is, I was ensuring that their grading along the property is not changing along the property line. And for Sean, it's just actually resubmitted that. So it is in the Saldo, but it's also, when you're reviewing a grading permit, these are all, you're reviewing all this stuff anyway. So it's not like it only suddenly applies. You know, if someone's, I believe the same type of language is also, I believe, in the stormwater ordinance. Very similar language.
Okay. All right, Chloe, go ahead. What was the next?
Okay, 450-57.
And anyone just jump in if there's something you want to clarify.
There's a sentence that says, where existing storm sewers are reasonably accessible and of adequate capacity, subdivisions and land developments may connect to the existing storm sewers. And Todd was asking, should we have that in there? Should we allow connections to existing storm sewers? You know, and should we charge a fee if they're going to tie in, or kind of getting into those questions? Or do you want to add to that, Todd? Go ahead. Of course.
Yeah. So where this becomes applicable is when you're connecting, let's say, the outlet of a stormwater. So let's just use for 2 examples. We have our development, our one just finished 114 Forest development, and our 650 Montgomery development, since you're familiar with both of those. 114 Forest, they have the new building, they have the stormwater system on the ground, collects the water, controls the rate, infiltrates what they can, but then there's the overflow from that basin has to go somewhere. So once that's routed through, the water slowly leaves that basin and goes via pipe into the storm sewer system in Windsor Avenue. That way, the water is controlled right into the storm sewer, slowed into the storm sewer, and discharges out. At 650 Montgomery, they have the whole stormwater system there as well. However, there is no storm sewer or, for blocks around there. So that stormwater basin actually discharges directly on Montgomery Avenue, which is not the ideal situation. It's just, there is no other choice there. So what this section is saying is you still have to comply with stormwater or code, you have to have rate reduction, but that discharge beyond that point, we're allowing you can get it into the storm sewer, so it's controlled at that point, not just discharging off the property. As far as a fee, that's a more complicated topic that actually would go beyond saldo. There are stormwater fees that process is regulated by the state, and if you're a borough, you then have to create an authority to collect stormwater fees, similar to like what Radnor has, or something along those lines.
I guess in regard to that provision, existing storm sewer accessibility, are you implying that that's all predicated that someone is already meeting the stormwater ordinance then, and that the only thing that would ever go into a storm drain is some sort of overflow from, that the amount that's going into the storm drain is already managed by the compliance with the stormwater ordinance? Is that the kind of an assumption?
If you were to build something now in the borough, you have to be complying with the stormwater code, which is requiring you to either maintain as the same level of stormwater leaving that site or reduce the stormwater leaving that site. So the net flow going into the storm sewer should be reduced. So like I'd say at 114 Forest, prior to that development, that was an office building and 2 parking lots that all just discharged immediately to the street. And now it is a much larger development with less stormwater leaving that property. So yes, you have to be compliant with stormwater code.
Did you say there was a tank, a retention tank, or where is it going with stormwater?
114 Forest, they have the building's the whole property, and the building all goes to a stormwater basin system that's on the Windsor Avenue side, underground, that property, that collects the water, holds it, infiltrates some of it, and then slowly releases the rest of it.
Would it make sense to add, just for sake of clarity, to that little provision that, you know, that this can only happen if someone is otherwise in compliance with the stormwater ordinance? I mean,
I wouldn't see an issue with that,
Yeah.
some language like that, no.
Should we have something like that, for clarity, that this means after the
Right.
stormwater has been properly
Right,
changed?
right. Be connected in full compliance with the stormwater, yeah.
yeah. I could see someone arguing the other side. There's
And
clever
then
people out there.
the third stormwater related comment or question that I had drawn out from the many comments was actually from Samantha, and she asked just to be sure that anything that was just unclear or ambiguous that happened with the 3 Elmwood project has been clarified or resolved with this updated ordinance draft.
So I would say the biggest one we have added is that steep slope language. So what we've added the riparian buffer language we were talking about. That property, when I was reviewing that, a lot of ordinances other ordinances I work with have code provisions that limit the amount of disturbance of steep and very steep slopes. That being slopes that are 15 to 25 or 25% or more percent, steep, which is the soils that you want to protect because they're subject to erosion. Your existing code had no protections like that. So I was kind of bluffing and saying that you can't disturb, even though I had no code to back on. So this revision has that language in it, where you can only disturb a certain percentage of steep slopes. That would have, if I had a stronger ordinance, you would have been less of that site would have been developable.
Chloe, was there anything else you find in the stormwater comments that you wanted to bring your attention?
Not especially. I think other questions and comments can either be handled at the staff level or the back and forth with just you, unless there's other comments that other people feel are important related to stormwater. And you all received Todd's comments as well, I believe.
So how would that back and forth work?
Well, we could, respond right in the draft directly to your comments, or you and Eric could meet and discuss it directly. We can go through it now if you want.
No, I really want to be careful with our time.
Yeah. And those are, I think, sort of the larger understanding how things work and sort of policy questions. And I appreciate Eric's clarification because I learned some things too.
Well, I'm sorry. There's one of my many comments, one I'd like to bring up
please.
now. It has to do with drainage from non-natural sources.
Mm-hmm.
So this is in the Saldo, right? But it's talking about sump pumps, air conditioning units, other dry weather flow, right?
Right.
So first of all, so this would apply only if someone is going through a subdivision or land development process. But many of these issues occur after that happens. Someone's in their house, they realize there's some pumps churning out tons of water, so they go and so if it's important to have a rule that discharge of water of these sources into the street, sidewalks, or sanitary sewer system is prohibited, is there some other part of our code that prevents those kind of hookups after the subdivision and land development process? But how would we, if a homeowner went and did that, how would we enforce that?
That's a good question. And I don't know.
So, so trying to look quickly to see what the exact language is in the stormwater code, but my default answer, my default enforcement would be you can't concentrate stormwater, or you can't concentrate water flowing off your property onto another property on the sidewalk. You are correct. The way as it is now, it's a good provision, but you're right, it is in the saldo. I have to double check what the stormwater code itself.
But that's just something to flag. And my other question is, I've seen examples where people actually drain this into the storm drains.
Right.
And would that be allowable then?
So it's kind of like a hierarchy you try and go down. Preferably what you want to see for a sump pump or an AC condensate is you want to see that dispersed onto a lawn. And the idea is it goes and it spreads out across the lawn, it can infiltrate, it spreads out to a shallow flow. That's the first. Then you kind of go down, what's the best scenario, and then in some instances, the best solution is actually to discharge it to a storm sewer. And that's if you start getting the groundwater or you just don't have it and you don't want the water going over a sidewalk, you don't want to go into a street.
Right.
That's just kind of one of those day-to-day, case-by-case type scenarios.
So I guess that falls into then the other situation. It would be good to check and see if that is articulated in the stormwater ordinance and actually what the process is. Like, can someone just go do it, or do they have to get a permit or whatever? And the reason I ask is because, our streams are the things that flood, right? And so if someone for their convenience decides they don't want their sump pump draining into their lawn, because gee, the lawn might get wet, so they put it in a stream, that means there's extra stream volume, which adds to some degree to, potential for erosion, potential for flooding. It's just more volume going in when really it should be spread across someone's yard. So I think it would be good to make sure that there are provisions about that in addition to those in the saldo, and that there's scrutiny of that. And that, I asked because there's a neighbor of mine who did put water into the stream through a storm drain, and I think we talked about this, and there's no way, there's no way to kind of make a complaint about it. The code allowed that to happen. I think it's important, to recognize there are people in town who live in flood zones. And so they pay for flood insurance each year. And so someone upstream who, for their convenience, is pumping water into a stream, is pumping it into a zone that someone else is paying for to be, and that's just not right. So I think that would be good to look at. Okay.
Todd, if you don't mind, are you talking about sump pump discharge? Was that one of your, I believe?
Yeah.
Yeah, the Norbert code specifically requires discharge piping for sump pumps to be 5 feet out of the building, but no closer than 10 feet from a property line. So there's no way that sump pumps should be crossing property lines or discharging over property lines.
I'll give you the address offline. I filed a work order for this a while back, Kevin, and I don't think we could figure out what to do about it. But
yeah, that's actually believe it or not, that's actually a borough-specific sump pump discharge kind of amendment to the code.
Okay. Well,
Kevin, which part of the code is that in?
It's the code section is 1113.1.5 sump pump discharge piping termination.
That is very specific.
Chloe, move us forward, please.
Okay, let's move.
Thank you, Kevin.
That was interesting. Sump pump specific code. Let's move to talking about plan processing and review, specifically about what happens when a new plan gets submitted. There was a question about whether a determination is made of whether it goes to the HARB or not and how that process works. So I'm going to turn this one to Michelle and Kevin. Michelle, what happens when you get a plan?
Sure. So when plans come into the office, Kevin Walsh, as our zoning officer, is really the first person to do that review. And with SALDOs, we have a 10-day review for completeness. So within that time, if the applicant was not already aware that they had to go to the HARB, we could notify them, like, this is the process. When we send out the timelines, these are the dates where you go to planning commission, council, there'll also be another one for the HARB. And so the way the HARB will work with the SALDO applications for the preliminary plan, they'll get a copy to review. And at that point, nothing official. They can have the applicant present if they want, but it's really at the final plan where they have to complete the certificate of appropriateness. Did I say everything, Kevin, or do you have anything to add?
No, and as a member of the HARB as well, Dennis and I talked about, we're still working things in what our process is internally, but the HARB's trying to get on board as soon as possible. So we'd like to jump in and offer our suggestions during the preliminary phase. We recognize that during the preliminary phase, the applicant generally doesn't have the details or elevations or kind of architectural details created that would satisfy what the HARB is looking for. So they're just trying to kind of flag things during the preliminary, and then during the HARB, they're actually going to need to formally apply and obtain that certificate of appropriateness.
I guess my main question about this was who actually makes the determination and when that a application should be referred to the HARB?
Yeah, that's me. And luckily for Norbert, I mean, I'm wearing a lot of hats where I'm the zoning officer, the building code official, and also on the HARB. So I'm seeing it across all the platforms. Generally, land development, obviously, I'm reviewing that as the zoning officer first. So I can refer that, or at least let them know that, hey, you're going to need to go through HARB, whether it's the advisory or the COA. But on the other side, when any applications come in as the building code official, I'm seeing permits coming in and I'm referring them to the HARB. So I kind of see it regardless of how, like, almost any project that needs a permit, I'm seeing it regardless whether I'm just the zoning officer or the building code official or just a member of the HARB.
I just want to be sure that it wasn't the applicant who was deciding whether they should go to the HARB or not.
They can, and that's kind of how the ordinance is written. They're able to kind of present an application to me, but generally a lot of people don't know kind of the process. It's still new. So they'll submit a zoning or building application to me, and then I'll say, hey, here's the actual process, whether it's the advisory review or the COA process that they need to go through, and I'll request whatever supporting documents we need.
Okay.
And Kevin, if I can just interject for a moment, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the general approach was one where HARB would essentially jump in after a preliminary plan was presented to Planning Commission and make recommendations in order to help expedite the process and not create drag later on, so that we could actually sort of fold into the process of making recommendations toward approval, so that when they came in later with the elevations and the sections and the, you know, whatever other information, that the information from HARB would be there. And that was generally the thinking, was we didn't want to make more paperwork and take more time, but rather try to fold into the, you know, a single process.
Yeah, so again, this is the whole process of the HARB is new, and Dennis and I kind of discussed, we understand that what we'd ideally like during the preliminary plan isn't submitted by the applicant. It's not necessary by the applicant, but we'd like to look at what they have starting as early as possible. And if we can foresee any issues that we can flag early enough, we're not going to, like, I guess, formally comment on them as part of a HARB hearing, but they just want to make sure that those items are ironed out before they have to formally submit. The problem with that is that we haven't received any land developments that had formally had to go through HARB yet. So that sounds good on paper, but we haven't seen that. So we haven't had the opportunity to kind of teach an applicant at preliminary what we're looking for, and then, you know, having them send in to the HARB a perfect product at the end.
So just to review what's actually written in this code section related to this is that when an application is submitted to the borough and it's reviewed for completeness, it then gets sent a lot of places, including to the HARB at the preliminary plan stage. Nothing has to happen with it from the HARB at the preliminary plan stage, but if they want to submit a review letter or invite the applicant to a meeting, they will know about it early on and be able to do that. And then in order to receive final plan approval from council, if a certificate of appropriateness is required, that's a requirement of the final plan. Like, you can't get final plan approval without having already received the certificate of appropriateness recommendation from the HARB. Or actually, no, the actual certificate of appropriateness, which is voted on by council. So somewhere between the preliminary plan submission and the final plan approval, if an applicant is required to go through that whole process with the HARB, they will have to do that. So that's what's currently written in the code. Do we feel that something else needs to be written into the code language, or that needs to be changed?
Well, I think we didn't have a HARB meeting last month, so I'm going like a couple months back. But in Jim Cornwell, is also a member of HARB. So, but I do believe in, I might not be getting the terminology correct, but I want to call it an advisory council, right, is available to say after the preliminary plan stage, we would, and we talked about this, there would be 2 people who would volunteer to work with the applicant to make recommendations that could help, ensure the success of a COA at the end of the process.
Yeah, I agree with that. And that's kind of what's fortunate about how Norbert set up, is that make sure that as the building code official, I'm able to forward those land developments as early as possible without delay to the HARB, and they can get whatever input they need as early as possible. Rather than wait to the final, when I can get it to them before it's actually required. Now, they're not going to need an actual advisory review, which is kind of what you said about the 2 members meeting, but there's probably going to be an informal meeting within the members that'll discuss the project and kind of push them along in the right direction.
But so just to recap, the process works is Kevin reviews, as well as the rest of the staff. Kevin makes a determination as to whether or not the applicant would have to go to the HARB for a certificate of appropriateness or an advisory review. It's up to them to do that at some point before the final, at their discretion. Okay.
To go to the HARB.
Yes.
Right.
Correct. Thank you. Is that?
Yeah, the advisory review will determine whether or not it needs to go to the HARB also. Right.
Or
wait,
the zoning officer.
Needs modification.
Or the building code official.
The zoning officers would determine that, right? Would determine what level of review they need, right?
Yeah, nomenclature. The building code official makes the determination of what process they need to go through. And ultimately, no permits can be issued. One thing we might want to tighten up, I can't issue any permits, but that doesn't mean land development can't be approved. Is that right, Chloe?
Sorry, say that again.
So I believe the ordinance reads, I can't approve any permits before the HARB process is complete, whichever one it is, advisory review or certificate of appropriateness. It means land development can't be approved. Is that correct?
If a certificate of appropriateness is required, then the land development cannot receive final approval until the certificate of appropriateness is received.
Yeah, so that covers everything then.
And that's from Borough Council.
Right.
So Borough Council.
HARB makes a recommendation on whether to approve or deny the certificate of appropriateness if required, and then council has to do the final.
First they vote on the certificate of appropriateness, then they can
approve
if they
the final
pass that,
plan.
then they can approve the development.
Right.
Right.
But a plan
They
cannot
pass the development or cannot approve development unless they voted to grant the COA.
Correct. That's here in the.
Or if the HARB has done the advisory meeting.
So there is a question perhaps about the advisory meeting. This doesn't say that the final plan, so a final plan for an application that has been previously granted preliminary plan approval shall be approved by Borough Council when evidence satisfactory to council and advice of the consultant has been provided, and that all of the following conditions have been fulfilled. And one of them is that a certificate of appropriateness, if required, has been issued. There isn't actually anything here about the advisory meeting, and I think we could add something that says an advisory meeting with a consultant or members of the HARB, however it's described, if required by the Norbert Historic District Ordinance, has been held.
Yes.
So I think we could add that, and probably we should, because they're supposed to have their meeting. It's not even binding. They just need to meet with them.
Right.
Yeah, we certainly could add that. I guess, is there any concern that we'd approve land development and then cannot issue any permits until that advisory meeting happens? So is there concern that you would approve land development and then they void the advisory to not get a permit, right? I don't think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think we can just put it in the plan processing and review section saying that an advisory meeting, if required by the Norbert Historic District Ordinance, has been held as one of the list of requirements before final plan approval.
So Kevin, the final plan approval, according to what Chloe is suggesting, could not occur unless there was an advisory meeting or a certificate of appropriateness. If either of those is required, it would have to happen before the final plan approval. As written right now, they'd only need the COA, right, Chloe? I think we'd have an advisory review meeting. Chloe's proposed to amend that, yeah.
Yeah, it should also be made clear that the advisory meeting is to help the applicant expedite the process so that they know early on what needs to be modified or what conditions are not being met, so that can sort of fold into the rest of up to the final submission, at which time they would have their COA and they would, all of that would be covered. They wouldn't have to go back at the end, back to the beginning with HARB and say, oh, but we weren't allowed to, have this door here.
Right. I mean, ideally, the advisory meeting happens very early in the process.
Yeah.
And I think it's written, as soon as they submit a preliminary plan, it gets sent to the HARB and the zoning officer or building code official makes a determination as to whether they need an advisory meeting or advisory review meeting or certificate of appropriateness.
Yeah. And I don't want to confuse matters, but just to be clear about where HARB is relevant, if a house built before 1945, they're doing an interior renovation, HARB's not involved. Building before 1945, something to the exterior, windows, doors, that kind of thing, HARB's involved. So it's not all of the historic district overlay anything happening within that. It's only things that are relevant in the exterior.
That's all described in the ordinance.
Right.
Yes.
And it's mostly about demolition.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so those kinds of things, Jennifer, are outlined in the preservation or the historic district ordinance. So we don't need to state them in the Saldo.
No. I mean, I just wanted to sort of, just state that.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm glad we had this conversation because I think that adding that one statement about that the advisory review meeting has to be held also before final plan approval. I mean, ideally early in the process, but it has to happen. It's required by the code and it has to happen before they can get their land development approved. So if it's required by the ordinance.
Okay. So Chloe, onward.
Okay, streets and sidewalks.
What? Mobile home parks.
Mobile home parks. I'm like skipping ahead. Okay. Mobile home parks, this is an issue that's not likely to come up in Norbert ever, potentially. However, the municipality's planning code does explicitly state that the subdivision and land development ordinance shall set forth in a separate and distinct article provisions regulating mobile home parks. And the municipality's planning code also explicitly includes a requirement to zone for all basic forms of housing, including mobile home parks. And we consulted with your solicitor, and he does recommend adding to both the Saldo and the zoning ordinance provisions as required by the MPC related to mobile home parks, as unlikely as they are to be proposed or built within the borough of Norbert in terms of complying with, you know, the enabling legislation for planning and zoning, recommends including them. So there's a couple of options. One is to just adopt this now as its own section in the Saldo and then add it to some zoning district when, you know, when a zoning change is happening. And then the other option would be to just wait on this and address it as its own separate issue in a few months. Say, okay, we have a meeting about mobile home parks and how do we want to deal with this, and trying to make really good standards in the Saldo related to mobile home parks and sort of focus on that a little bit. So yeah, that's kind of the issues.
So are you saying that our zoning code needs to, that's a use that needs to be accommodated within the zoning code?
Yes. And your solicitor concurs.
It's Pennsylvania law.
Yeah.
We don't have a choice.
And so do we have to designate districts for?
I'm just,
Correct. Or at least one district.
I'm just confused on where there's and I don't know if there's a minimum lot size. I assume there is somewhere for a mobile home park. How this could be even relevant to the physical realities of property use in Norbert.
So I would say my experience with this code section is everybody has it in their Saldo. They may or may not have it in their zoning, but their Saldo has, even the most affluent of neighborhoods has a mobile home Saldo code section.
Is there something about a mobile home that is confined to a mobile home park? Like why?
So there's two things about mobile homes. One is that there's separate provision in the state legislation that allows a mobile home to be placed on any lot that's zoned for single family housing, even if it doesn't comply with all of the regular building codes and zoning provisions. But a mobile home park is a specific type of use that has, you know, multiple mobile homes on one parcel, typically with some sort of shared open space. It's kind of a particular use. And it is usually on a larger area than would be, like, you're not going to be able to fit a mobile home park on a single lot in Norbert. Someone would have to aggregate many lots. I am not saying that it's likely or even possible. Right. Just saying that both I and your solicitor recommend amending the code to be in compliance with state law. And I would say, like, and then just forget about it because it's never going to happen here, but put it in.
Well, let me ask about individual mobile homes, because what I think what is written here is different from what you just said. What's written here, it says individual mobile homes or manufactured housing may be erected on any lot where the use is permitted. Individual mobile or manufactured homes shall be in compliance with Chapter 500 zoning. I believe what you said was different.
Kevin, do you know offhand, there's something about allowing mobile homes on any lot that's zoned single family? And I don't have that in front of me. No?
I mean, if someone wanted to put a manufactured home up and it met the lot size, building frontage and all that, wouldn't be perfect, but I don't know how.
Right, but if they wanted to not put any of the setbacks and like ignore certain setbacks, right, then
that could be a problem. So I guess that's a really important question. Do they have to follow the zoning code or not?
And could someone install it on their property as a second building, like as a utility?
No. Well, then it's not. It's being treated as if it's a single family home.
Well, could it be an ADU all of a sudden?
Or infill housing?
And then would it not be subject to our ADU standards?
Right, so I think the basic question here is, Chloe, earlier you said the state law allows people to put mobile homes on a lot, in a residential lot, even if it doesn't meet the zoning code requirements.
Yeah.
But here it says, yeah, you can put one there, but you gotta meet the zoning code requirements.
I'm gonna have to clarify exactly. There's some provision that I have to look up about that a mobile home is supposed to be allowed on any single family lot in Pennsylvania, but I can't put my fingers on it right now. And I'm not sure what exactly provisions of the code they'd have to meet. I think it might be just the building code, the regular building code that they don't have to meet, and they do have to comply with zoning. But
Okay, well, you better double check that.
I'll have to look that up.
That's an important point, I think. I guess there's nothing we can do about it if it's in the state law.
Yeah, Chloe, I'll look that up while the next sections really don't apply to me. I'll try and look that up while we're going.
Thanks, Kevin. And then mobile home parks are their own separate thing, as I stated here. So, yes. Kevin and I will try to clarify either during this meeting or later what exactly the rules are for putting a single mobile home on a lot that's zoned for a single family use. In terms of the mobile home park, are there inclinations of how to deal with that? Do you want to just adopt this language that we've stuck in here and forget about it? Or do you want to sort of focus on it another time to try to deal with the mobile home park issue?
Well, I don't know. My mind keeps going. We passed a cell phone tower ordinance because you know what? There's probably someone out there just scouting for municipalities that have nothing in their cell phone tower laws and is looking to cause trouble. That's why we passed the regulated uses ordinance, because people are looking for places for adult bookstores and dispensaries. And so if we don't say anything about it in our zoning code, then we're looking for trouble. I can't imagine there are people out there looking for places to have mobile home parks, and it's going to go to the effort to assemble land in Norbert to even create an issue out of it. So that's my only observation. I don't know where that leaves us. I mean, I really don't, like I was telling my partner about this, she goes, really, you got to spend your time talking about this tonight? So part of me is like, okay, whatever, but that doesn't seem responsible either. So I'm kind of curious what other people do.
Is there a minimum size for a mobile home park? Can you have a micro one, have a large side lot?
I mean, you have to be able to fit at least a couple of mobile home units on it.
Well, that's the first question. What defines a mobile home park? Is it more than one mobile home, or is it, more than 5 mobile? I mean, is it,
Is an Airstream trailer a mobile home?
In which case, I'm cool.
Well, like, you could find a place for 5 of them.
Yeah, 2 or more mobile homes as defined in the municipality's plan.
2 or more, okay.
But they don't say what size lot that is.
No, they don't.
But so they don't define, they don't give a minimum size lot.
No, but presumably it would have to be at least large enough to accommodate
It's
to
ridiculous.
mobile
So
homes.
where this is like nowhere.
But
And they don't have to meet building code standards.
Well, I assume
It could
the
be
industry
blocked
has
there.
I assum the industry
Well,
has
That's
some
true, like a
kind of.
UL kind
So this
of.
code established the provisions specifically in here about utilities, water supply, sewage disposal, fuel oil systems, liquefied petroleum gas, permits and license inspections. So like this is the generic code sections that have to do with the requirements of mobile home park. My observation, as little as I flipped through other municipalities' mobile home park section, this is pretty much.
It seems like a gigantic waste of time to do anything more than the generic section that everybody uses. I mean, do we really think that this is an issue that we need to?
Right.
I can say two things here.
Obsess on?
I mean, one is Chloe, it would be interesting to know if they have to follow the other aspects of the code, like minimum lot size and all that. But, you know, there's another interesting issue here, which is some of, you know, there's been conversation we've had in the past about these things called tiny houses, which actually are mobile. And I've asked Kevin about it, and Kevin has said, oh, we regulate that as a vehicle. But I'm curious if there's some benefit or to considering whether or not this provision would allow or, you know, relate to the notion that people might want to build an ADU out of a tiny home, like just roll it in and park it there.
Well, the other question in my mind is, are there different things we're talking? I mean, what's a mobile home as opposed to an RV, as opposed to, I mean, there are RVs parked in the borough. People have RVs and they park them in their driveway. Are they putting an accessory dwelling unit in by parking their RV? I don't know. Is this something that we should be or need to regulate if we're going to be talking about this?
This applies, this is quite a long section on the mobile home parks that doesn't talk about anchoring them to the ground and certain requirements, skirting them, and so on. So it isn't that they can't just be a trailer, unless they have been sort of secured to the site.
Well, mobile homes are not normally secured to the site, are they?
Well, this says
Usually anchored.
they're on a
They fly
stand,
away in tornadoes?
they're on a pad that's been graded and compacted.
So this code would require a subdivision land development plan be submitted to the borough.
The fact that it's not a building type in our zoning code, I think, isn't that? It sounds problematic.
Well, here's the definition for mobile home, just in case you're curious. It's in the Saldo. A single-family detached dwelling intended for permanent occupancy, which may not meet local building codes. So it doesn't have to meet the building codes, but does meet the standards of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development as indicated by the structural engineering bulletins provided to the Borough Council by the applicant. I'm not sure what those are, structural engineering bulletins.
Generally, that's a third-party certification. So that's almost an internal policy decision. In other municipalities, they'll allow an applicant to submit a third-party certification that it meets building code requirements from the mobile home internally. And then we check the utility connections, plumbing, mechanical, electrical, footings, things like that. That's a policy decision if we want to go there. But typically inspect inside the mobile homes.
That's in.
Is that they're required by state law?
If you're looking at this model code, it's 450.75.B.4 is the code section that he'd be referring to there. Shall inform the borough, it's connected to water, sewer, electrical, schedule inspection, determine the mobile home is anchored and located in Ordinance chapter. Code enforcement officer will not inspect the mobile home until but make sure it has the certification, federal safety standards from the U.S. Department of Housing and Development.
Arrived at a site complete and ready for occupancy except for minor and incidental unpacking and assembly operations, constructed so that it may be used with or without a permanent foundation. Can also includes any roofed addition to the other part, which is extra rooms, covered patios, porches, etc.
Does it say anything about whether it's hitched to a motor vehicle or whether it has the ability?
So in the last section, it regulates anchoring, stability, skirts, the hitch, So the hitch or tow bar attached to mobile home for transport purposes shall be removed and remain removed from the mobile home when it's placed on its mobile home stand.
Okay, so it's not a self-propelled.
No, it's supposed to be the anchor, the hitch is removed and it is anchored to the ground.
Okay.
And the idea behind that is going with what Todd said, is that the lack of an engine, if it were to be propelled, I guess, mobile home, it's actually registered as a vehicle under the motor vehicles. So by not having that engine, it's therefore like a permanent structure in our opinion. Actually, the state.
So by definition, an RV cannot be a mobile home. Okay.
Correct.
Right. Okay, so I think it's not probably worth our time to spend a large amount of time on this. I will verify this, but everything I said about the use mobile home park, you know, that is by state law required to be a separate section in your SALDO and be included, permitted in some zoning district. In terms of an individual mobile home or manufactured home on a single lot, I believe that there's some state provision that overrides regular building code, but they have to still be in compliance with HUD and DCED codes.
Which is what the definition says here.
Right.
But how they interact with zoning is another issue, the mobile home park.
Right.
And how they interact with zoning, a single mobile home. Can you look into that?
Yes, I can. My recommendation would be to include this section in your SALDO adoption without worrying a whole lot about what it says. But if you want to do something different, that's totally fine.
I'd much rather spend hours and hours
I mean, the
talking
fact that
about
it's not listed as a building type in the zoning code.
Right. Well, we will get to that.
Can we secede
Your
from
solicitor
Pennsylvania
recommends we
last
allow it in
I would say, I
one
guess another
district.
way to say is if you include it with the language as per the solicitor as required for minimal compliance with them.
But if you think there's only one zoning district where would even remotely be considered.
Which is,
Do tell.
yeah.
Yes.
City
I
of
think a mobile park along
property.
Montgomery, I think along Montgomery Avenue would be a real selling point for the borough.
No, it wouldn't.
Okay,
Okay.
so we'll table that till we hear more from you.
Sounds good.
Sidewalks and planting strips.
Gotta do something to bring the housing values down.
This is
Yes.
Article 4.
Well, no, it's the fourth topic. In the
Fourth topic,
list.
it's also Article 4.
It's also in Article 4, that is correct. So this is one that we actually discussed with some depth a lot of months ago. And we had various thoughts about what exactly to require in terms of the street and sidewalk widths in particular, how to deal with what those widths should be. So just go very quickly. So to review, I gave you a memo on this very many months ago. There are currently street and sidewalk widths are regulated in the zoning. The sidewalk width is tied to the zoning district, but there's also a requirement that sidewalk width and planting strip width be in compliance with Table 11, which is a reflection of existing conditions except for on Montgomery Avenue. So there's already a conflict in the zoning in some places between what Table 11 requires and what it says per zoning district. So there's an issue that needs to be dealt with anyway. Providing an opportunity to say, well, what do we really want here and where should it be located? We have a countywide document called WACMONCO that recommends a minimum of 5-foot sidewalk width everywhere and 8-foot in walkable commercial districts. That doesn't mean that's what you have to do in Norbert because it's not what you have in a lot of situations, but just for your information. I definitely think that the code should require tie-in to existing conditions on the sides and that you may want to consider what sidewalk widths you really want to require in a redevelopment scenario, and if it's a borough goal to upgrade some sidewalks, like would the borough ever want to seek grant funding to widen sidewalks or add planting strips and move sidewalks back in certain districts? Because that can impact what you ask for in a development scenario. Because if someone is going to develop and put in part of that for you, that's obviously great. This is just from Rockmont Co. And then there's some issues related to the planting strip. Best practices would be to put something there between moving traffic and a sidewalk, especially if there's no parked cars or anything else there. Include greening and stormwater management in the planting strip, and recommend a minimum of 5 foot in width if supporting trees, a 4 foot width for smaller trees potentially. So the question is, where is it important to accommodate trees in the planting strip? And just to note that if there's no on-street parking, some kind of separation from traffic is even more important for the pedestrian experience. Okay, so I'm proposing moving the sidewalk and planting strip width requirements to the saldo from the zoning, and using both roadway classification and zoning district to determine what exactly the width required would be, and that the applicant would be required to install the greater of the two. I'll show you the table in a second, but you've already seen it too, but require the tie-in. So just look at the table here for a second. This is what was in the draft that I circulated to you. So first is by zoning district. In 5A and 5B, it would require a 6 foot sidewalk and a 4 foot planting strip. And then in the other districts, a minimum of a 4 foot sidewalk and a 2 foot planting strip with a note that says, or continue existing conditions if greater. There's just a couple of places where there's a 3 or 4 foot wide planting strip, and we wouldn't want an applicant to reduce that. But then there's also these street classifications, a reminder that the only arterial in the borough is Montgomery Avenue, and the collectors are Haverford and Wynwood. So an arterial would require a much wider planting strip and sidewalk. And an urban collector anywhere along that street would require also the wider sidewalk. And then existing local roads, and if in the rare case there's a new or extended local road, that's when the 5 foot sidewalk is put in there. And that 5 feet, it comes from, that's a width that really allows 2 people to walk comfortably side by side or pass each other. 4 feet, it's okay. It's definitely usable, but 5 feet is more comfortable for pedestrians.
Would it make sense to put your asterisks next to most of these categories, especially the first ones, 5A and 3A, for the sidewalk minimum width as well, and planting strip? I mean, I see you have the carve out saying that if you have a wider planting strip than 2 feet on your street, then you should continue the prevailing condition. Should that not also be the case for the sidewalk? So if you have a 5 foot sidewalk on the street, why not continue the 5 foot sidewalk?
Right, no, that makes sense. I'm not sure if that condition exists anywhere, but maybe it does.
No, I
and
agree,
certainly
but,
it should,
yes.
Yes, if the prevailing condition is already 5 feet, that should be continued. Does that make sense?
I'm curious what the sidewalk widths are in Norbert.
Almost universally 4 feet.
Or less.
That would be that table.
Yeah, table 11 from your code.
They're wider in the 5A, but
Oh, yeah,
Right.
and that makes sense. I mean, I think the 5A, 5B districts I'm in agreement with, but I'm not sure I'm in agreement with the other districts. It almost seems like this is a form zoning issue that, yes, they should be continued at the width where they are or made larger if possible, but I don't think it should be a requirement to be wider because that's going to wreak havoc on streets. If you're going to all of a sudden have wide.
It's gonna look like hell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's gonna look like Los Angeles.
Well, I guess that's kind of the question. So we, on the staff level, spent a lot of time struggling with this table.
Yeah, I
On
can imagine.
what it is that how best to regulate it and what it is envisioned. So like in one end, we have like the table 11, which is here's what every single street in the borough is, here's what the strip is, here's what the sidewalk is. Do you want to keep that, or do you want to regulate towards?
It begs the basic do we have a problem with the sidewalk widths as they
Yeah, I mean,
are?
I'm used to walking single file.
Are people getting clipped by cars or, you know, or complaining? I mean, is there a problem we're trying to solve that isn't a problem?
I mean, it's nice to have the green strip to protect you from cars, but otherwise, yeah.
And to stagger them in a width, I think poses danger.
Yeah, more dangerous.
Tripping hazard or.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, I think we just said they had to be tied.
They'll have to tie into the adjacent properties.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
It won't be like a
the
random.
whole thing is it's establishing just a minimum.
You're saying like a.
Well, except that
Sorry.
So let's just clarify the thing about the tie-in. So let's say there's an existing 4-foot sidewalk that's adjacent to the curb. One property on the block gets redeveloped and it's required to have a 2-foot planting strip and a 4-foot sidewalk. There would be a requirement that at the edges of the property that it meet.
You have to transition any sidewalk.
It would widen so that it would meet the sidewalk of the neighboring property just at the end there.
I guess the question is, are we happy with Royal Bank? Because that's one of only 2 properties we've required the strip to be installed as per the current standards.
And that's in 5B, right?
Yeah.
I think that's huge improvement, where those businesses are providing us planting strip where there were none before. It's like night and day.
Yeah, but 5B is a very specific.
Yeah,
That's what he's asking about. Though.
yeah,
Yeah,
5B.
yeah.
Adam, you were going to say something. I just was trying to answer Jen's question. Go ahead, Bob.
No, I concur with Jim.
I'm looking forward to more of those properties getting.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So we can have
That's
more
where
of
the
that.
discontinuity is actually
Yeah,
useful as it gets changed over time.
yeah.
Are you able to put the table up again?
Yes, definitely.
So I guess maybe so one way of looking at it, you have like these commercial corridors where maybe you want to be enforcing and trying to, and really working towards there. And maybe do you feel the same way or not feel the same way on like the residential areas? Like, do we really, if you want to go after the commercial properties, like we really want to get that strip in there, not as worried about the residential districts?
Definitely.
That's my feeling, yeah.
But, so I'm not, what's the problem with the table as it's written?
The greater, or existing conditions is greater.
What's wrong with that?
Well, it's saying it's a minimum of 4 feet, which is basically just, because of ADA and, accessibility issues. And then,
In a small number of streets, 3 streets, it might be wider, 2 collectors and 1 arterial. I mean, if in most of the borough, sidewalks are 4 feet, what this table says, in most of the borough, aside from 5A and 5B, and aside from Montgomery, Haverford, and Wynwood, you've got 4 feet sidewalks. That's basically it. Unless they're wider, then you stick with what's wider. So the only place this is pushing sidewalks to be wider than 4 feet is 5A, 5B, Montgomery, Haverford, and Wynwood. The only place where that's probably going to, be complicated is Wynwood, where sometimes it's even less than 4 feet.
Mhm.
But I don't really feel like it's the end of the world for people there to have a 4-foot sidewalk. It's not like they don't have the space. So I don't know. I mean, I don't feel like this is going to wreak havoc. I think the planting strip is more likely, because I don't know that every street, I don't know that they're as ubiquitous as that in most of the borough.
I mean, that's suggesting that there's 6 feet from the curb line to the inside edge of the sidewalk. And I just don't know if that's the case in most of the borough.
I don't think most blocks have a planting strip.
Well, that's a question of mapping. But the one thing you might look at here is to say if a percentage of the block face, or comply with a minimum percentage of the block face if it's less than the planting strip standard. So if your block face has no planting strip today, we require you
Yeah,
to.
but do you require your neighbors to then all of a sudden jump into one so that the sidewalk has to go like?
That's what I'm saying. If there's no planting strip on the block today.
On the block, okay.
Do you, why, are you going to make every new parcel kind of jog like that? Or do you say, we'll continue the prevailing condition?
Right.
I would say not even the entire block, the adjacent property. If there's not a planting strip on the adjacent property.
Look at just.
It might be helpful to look at specific examples.
Okay, let's go.
I'd like to.
I've been waiting for this for 3 months.
My hunch is for residential
Is that
blocks.
Norbert?
Yes.
My hunch is for residential
planning
blocks,
strip.
it doesn't much matter. For 5A and 5B, particularly 5B, I think it does matter. I think in 5B it is important in the
Yeah.
long run
I
that we
agree.
build
I
to the
agree.
standard that
Yeah.
we've seen, even if it takes the rest of our lifetimes and then some. I think it'll be better. Residential blocks, what's the value of planting strip? Place to plant trees? Well, if you move the sidewalk to the curb, you can just plant trees on the other side of the sidewalk.
Right.
Many blocks, you see this now, the Street Tree Commission is planting
Is planting them, exactly.
in the first
In the
10
front
feet
yard.
of the
Yeah.
yard.
Better
So
place for trees
it's not like we don't have a place
Yeah.
for trees.
Yeah.
Is it to protect people from traffic? Well, most blocks have parallel parking. So yeah, a door could open and things like that, but is a 2-foot planting strip really going to make that huge of a difference in that case? Some blocks don't have parking. That's because of fire access.
Well, that's
But-
interesting, Todd, because look at that picture. The sidewalk is right along the street where there's no parking.
This isn't a stretch that I have personally walked in Norbert, and I find it very unpleasant to walk along that part of Haverford
Yeah, you're
where
right.
the sidewalk is
Right
narrow.
on the
So
street.
there's a transportation planning term called the shy zone, where people don't want to walk next to where cars are traveling, and it's, you can consider like a 2-foot shy zone. So if you have a 4-foot sidewalk, cars are traveling right next to the curb, and people naturally have a 2-foot shy zone. That leaves them essentially with 2 feet of. Really
Okay, so maybe,
Yeah.
but see, that's an arterial, right, or a collector.
Right, so this-
It's a collector, so maybe
this
we
is
could
a-
say that's also a place where a planting strip would be valuable because it's a collector.
This is just what a 4-foot planting strip and a 6-foot sidewalk would look like on this stretch of
Oh, I
Haverford.
see.
So this is just to see if you think that this is an appropriate requirement or if we should do something different.
Well, but right now, if you can't do that because that is private land, right? Or
Right.
is
You
there?
can't put a sidewalk on private land, right? Pretty
Yeah,
sure.
this would require, and this would be in a redevelopment scenario, and it would require that we would ask for additional right-of-way dedication. And we can set the right-of-way dedication request numbers based on what we want for planting strip and sidewalk, if that makes sense. So like if this property were to redevelop, for example, which is not especially likely, but you never know, ask for right-of-way dedication that would move this right-of-way line back here.
Wow. That's a big ask.
I don't think it's a big ask. I personally could install the sidewalk, but
So I think the way to look at this is, are there some streets in the borough where we think over time we would like to migrate to more generous sidewalk and planting strip standards than we tend to see?
Yeah.
Otherwise, and are there areas of the borough where we're just kind of like, it's okay the way it is and just build to the standard as long as it's a minimum of 4 feet sidewalk and we're fine?
Well, and Haverford is one of those streets because
So
it
this is the
more
answer to the
traffic.
question. Montgomery is clearly one of them, where
Yeah.
we'd love to see new standard. Maybe Haverford's another one.
Yeah,
Maybe the 5A and the 5A is another one. So and maybe Wynwood Avenue Road, whatever it is.
Well,
Maybe it's our collector streets, our 2 collector streets and our arterial, and our 5A and 5B, where we'd like to move towards.
And Wynwood Avenue is actually really nice the way it is right now. It has a
well,
big-
you know, lots of people, I don't know. Anytime I've walked on Wynwood Avenue, I don't think I've ever passed more than 1 or 2 other people. I mean, it's not like
A lot of
you
people
have
walk.
hordes of people walking on
It's
Wynwood
got that
Avenue.
shy zone quality.
I'll say I walk it every day. And the blocks where there is no planting strip are downright scary.
Yeah.
And the blocks where there is a planting strip
Never
are
bothered me.
okay. Oh, yeah.
So Wynwood Avenue and Wynwood Road, there's a lot of, that's a long part of the borough on the whole
Oh,
website. I have
that's the Winwood
This is
Road.
the Winwood
Winwood
Road.
Road, yes, I would agree with
That's
Winwood
the
Road.
Winwood Road.
But now Winwood Avenue.
Winwood Avenue is where I walk.
Okay.
Yeah, Winwood Avenue is really
This piece is
generous.
Winwood Road.
Well, north of, part of it is and part of it
Oh,
isn't.
the part closer to town is less,
Yes.
yeah.
But there are almost nobody walks there. I mean,
No, but there is traffic and it is a little scary. It's just like going into the tunnel. I mean, what do you?
I'm from North
It's just-
A lot of people jog.
The tunnel is
A
terrible.
lot of people jog there.
The tunnel is a whole nother
You'd be
issue.
That's a whole, that's a
I don't
different
know how to
story.
fix that with the cell.
So anyway, I guess the point is whether we agree on Winwood
$20 million
Avenue or
grant
not.
from him.
I think this is the way to look at it. Are there parts of the borough where things are relatively okay in terms of the planting strip and sidewalk, as long as it's a 4-foot sidewalk? And are there parts of the borough where we want to migrate to better standards for whatever reason? And it looks like, we kind of feel like Montgomery, 5A, 5B, and Haverford, we're still debating Winwood, but is that the right way to look at it? A good way to look at it?
Yeah, let me just show you, I have a lot of examples in here. Let me just show you one, no, I missed one. Yeah, this one, because this is a small local road, the border of the borough, has a 4-foot sidewalk and no planting strip and no on-street parking. I just think the on-street parking thing makes such a difference. If there's cars going by at your elbow, it's a really unpleasant pedestrian experience. And so I just took a look at this. What would this 2-foot planting strip, 4-foot sidewalk look like here? Again, you know, how much are you going to see a redevelopment scenario along here? A little bit. Here's 146 Marion, for example. But they're not going to be required to put it in because we haven't adopted this. But, you know, you might see a couple properties redeveloped, but the rest of it would have to be, you know, borough investment. And obviously the people who park in front of their garage here would not be very happy about this. But
Well, that's the thing about Rockland, between the fact that there's so many buildings right up on the line of the sidewalk.
yeah, it's not, it's these garages.
Okay, show us some more. Let's
Okay, you want to see all the pictures? I
Well,
skipped a lot of them. I went to the roads we
they
were
seem to
talking
generate
about.
conversation.
Okay, so we talked about this one, Haverford. This other Haverford example, the current code, even as it's written now, doesn't really work here because the zoning district would require a planting strip here in the 5A district. And what's down there is not a planting strip. It's, you know, there's street trees and street furniture, outdoor dining, utilities, and sidewalk in this area. I think that the widths are okay, but we have to change something. Even as it's written now, I think it's not. It's kind of a problem the way that the requirements are written here. And that brings up the question of whether you want to redefine the planting strip and allow things like this in certain districts explicitly or call it something else. So that's another issue that we might be able to talk about. Okay, let's just take a look at Montgomery. I think there wasn't a lot of disagreement here, but this is this is in the 5B district. So you'd see, this is actually slightly different from what your current code has, and it was based on the previous conversation we have and the Walk-On Code document, which recommends an 8-foot sidewalk in walkable commercial districts. So this is an 8-foot sidewalk and a 6-foot planting strip, but I think it could be, you know, slightly different if you'd like to see that. This is certainly one of the areas where it's very unpleasant to walk on a 4-foot sidewalk with a lot of fast-moving traffic. And then this is Montgomery Avenue. Down a little bit, this is the 3A district here. There are not all residential uses, but again, with the 6-foot sidewalk and the 8-foot, 6-foot planting strip in green and the 8-foot sidewalk in orange. So does this still work even where we have, you know, these residential uses along Montgomery?
No, see, that's the thing. It should be in commercial
Yeah,
district.
yeah, I agree. Once you get to the residential zone,
They could be dropped back.
Then you get run over by
Yeah.
cars just because residential zone. I'm not sure I quite follow what
Is
you're
that
saying.
still 5B?
I think Norbert
No,
is
it's
so
not.
small.
3A.
Oh, okay.
3A district, different zoning district, but it's still an arterial road.
Right. Yeah.
it seems to me the challenge here is retrofit issues when you're dealing parcel by parcel in a built-up area.
Yeah.
But, you know, as far as I'm concerned, no, you don't want the sidewalk up against the fast-moving traffic. It's not the way it should be. But we have an existing built condition, so under what scenario do you change the cross-section?
I think one of the things Clay suggested is we put in the saldo, even if it's not ever going to redevelop, the borough Monday might want to invest its own money in reconstructing the sidewalk and with grant funds, and therefore having it in the saldo would make that easier. I'm going to propose another way of doing this, Clay, because Norbert is small. I mean, I think altogether we're still only talking about maybe 10 streets and maybe 30 to 40 blocks where we kind of feel like we need to have better conditions than we've got. I feel like it may be worth saying there's a vast part of the borough where we just, as long as we have 4-foot sidewalks, the planting strips are maintained the way they are, great. And then there's some streets, like different stretches of Montgomery, different stretches of Haverford, downtown, maybe Rockland Avenue, maybe, you know, we could talk about Essex Avenue, where on the east side of Essex, you know, Windsor on the side where there's no parking, down near the playground. I mean, there may be blocks where there is no parking on the side. And we could probably just identify all those and then come up with a couple of typologies and say, like, this stretch of Montgomery typology A, this type of Montgomery typology B, and just really almost do it that way rather than like have a system.
Right.
Because Norbert's so small.
Yeah. That sounds good. So, well, let me say one more thing about putting it in the saldo, which is that it allows you to adjust or waive the requirements in response to existing conditions. So if you were to put in, you know, anywhere along Montgomery requires an 8-foot sidewalk and a 6-foot planting strip, but then this property owner with this is actually, who knows what this is. Anyway, they have this existing house or whatever, shed, garage thing here. They said, you know, it's too wide. Can we please do a 4-foot planting strip and a 5-foot sidewalk? You could say, you know, okay, we're willing to grant a waiver for that based on existing conditions. So that's one additional plus of putting it in saldo.
As opposed to the zoning.
As opposed to the zoning ordinance where they have to go through a zoning hearing in order to get that kind of responsiveness. So Todd, I think that's a great idea. It sounds like specifically where there's a sidewalk next to moving traffic, there might be an interest in improving the conditions, and or the previous example from Montgomery, where you're really in a commercial district, you might want a wider sidewalk, especially if you're seeing redevelopment scenarios here.
Yeah.
Can I ask for some guidance on like this stretch here? I think you may not need an 8-foot sidewalk potentially because
maybe 6.
More residential uses.
Maybe it's a type with a 2-foot planting strip and a 6-foot sidewalk.
So remind me, this is zoned residential.
This is zoned residential, so
Right.
3A, the lowest density.
The issue here, I would say, is like if you're walking along a 4-foot sidewalk in a lot of Norbert, I mean, half the time if it gets too crowded, I just walk down the street, you know? Like that's the relief valve, you just walk down the street. You can't do that here. You know, so like if someone's coming with a double wide or whatever, you know, so it feels to me like 4-foot might be too little, 6 foot might be fine in this stretch, because you can't go into the street or, but I mean, that's how I would look at it. There's sort of a hierarchy, like the biggest, most generous would be like in the 5B district, and maybe 3A, these blocks are a little less generous.
Right.
And I do have a little concern in like the previous slide. I agree with, you know, in those areas to have the wider planting strip and the wider sidewalk. I worry that the parking may be affected and you might actually lose parking spaces on some properties.
I think you would probably.
And that
here
could be an issue.
And over, well, this isn't parking spaces directly, but in terms of the layout of the parking lot.
Well, just in the cartway with, you know, with the
Right.
the backup space and that kind of thing.
Right.
So I think that's a consideration that needs to be considered.
Well, the whole of Montgomery Avenue needs to be addressed. And that's
You know,
such a major planning problem. So,
But I'm saying you can't solve the planning strip and sidewalk and then screw up the parking either.
no, I'm saying that, but Montgomery Avenue itself, I mean, it could be made a 3-lane road.
Well, that's a whole different.
I know.
I'd argue differently, Dave. I would think, you know, none of these changes are going to happen fast. They'll happen.
So, I think
it's time to start planning for people, for walkers, not cars, and let the chips fall where they may.
I agree with that. I do think, though, that there are some, you could make a few modifications to the table.
But did I hear the recommendation could be to have typologies numbered or lettered or whatever, like basically little relationship diagrams, and individual streets could be mapped to typologies, or to individual blocks, right? So you just refer to which number you are, and so if that's what everyone said, then I can reflect that in the minutes. Then the only other thing here too is that we're talking about the future of Montgomery Avenue, and it may be a separate issue of what the cross-section should be or the full land use pattern on both sides of the road and so on. But it's been really kind of heartbreaking to see all of the trees along City Avenue that are 100 years old, that have outgrown their tree strip and are being killed by the curb line now. Because all I'm saying is that, let's say that this block face, our vision is to try to make it into a boulevard, and it literally can be the difference, you know, whether the tree survives or not if we have a wide enough strip. It's over when the tree is at its biggest and most grandest, that's when it could be killed by the inadequate width. And so it's a long range issue, but in some cases we might want more than 6 feet if we really believe in the future of trees on the street.
And if we're really serious about walkability, we really can't have this conversation without talking about lighting. I mean, are we going to have lighting that's designed for cars? Or are we going to have, you know, like the big swooping over the street thing? Or are we going to have lighting designed for people walking and pedestrians so that if there is variation in the length of the sidewalk, they can see it? That kind of thing. Just holistic. Of course, renewable energy, electric.
Is that covered, Eric, in the lighting requirements, either in the zoning or the Saldo redevelopment?
Like street frontage lighting?
Like what Jennifer was saying, pedestrian lighting.
Pedestrian scale lighting, I do not believe your code has a pedestrian scale lighting. The downtown.
There was something in
a little something
about the, yes.
You do in the downtown area, you do have like the pedestrian scale lights.
We have that in the 5B.
I'm trying to think on like Montgomery Avenue, if you would have, I don't know if there is.
I can think of, I go jogging actually down Montgomery at night, usually like 10 o'clock at night, and the lighting's terrible.
So, you can switch to talking about lighting, which was actually coming up on our list.
Well,
But we can go to that now. I think Adam had a good segue to something else that was in this presentation. What were you going to say, David?
Well, I have one comment. My concern about putting this in the Saldo, which goes back to one of the starting premises about the form-based code and rewriting the code right from the very beginning, was that we wanted to have a user-friendly document that a layman could pick up and figure out what the hell is required on his property. And one of the things I think the code as it was written does really well is have those diagrams in it that a person with no professional background could look at it and say, oh, that's what's required.
Dave, we could put such diagrams in the Saldo.
Well, except once we put it in Saldo, you have another place you got to go to. Or worse, there's another place you have to know to go to look for it. And that complicates, that dilutes the original premise of doing the code the way we wanted to do it. And I just want to mention that since I have one of the institutional memories that goes back to the very first discussions about why the old code doesn't work. And it all started because one weekend, I searched all weekend for where in the old code the parking requirements were. And they weren't in the code, they were in some bizarre subsection of something else. And we've tried really hard to solve that problem. So I just say that.
But Dave, there's other issues. I mean, one is, the auto is going to be there no matter what, so someone's going to have to look at it. They have to look at the stormwater code, they have to look at the saldo, they have to look at the landscape code, they have to look at the zoning.
I don't want to belabor it, I just said, that was the starting premise. I thought it worked pretty well.
It's important though to say this. The other reason, the difference between the zoning code and the saldo, there's two important differences as I understand them. One is zoning code applies to anything that requires a zoning permit. So,
I understand.
But the saldo only applies to land development and subdivisions, right? On the other hand, the saldo is a lot more flexible in terms of exceptions and waivers, whereas the zoning is extremely rigid in terms of like the proverbial garage that's 6 feet into the sidewalk. So in order to get that, they'd have to go for a variance, very difficult, whereas you can get a waiver from the saldo. So I think those, while of course we want it to be clear, there are other factors at play as to where something lives in the code. So, and I think whether it's in the zoning code, the saldo, an elegant, easily drawn and visual solution is a good one. It's good to strive for.
Well, then I would suggest, in terms of thinking about the average property owner who's not a design professional, does this for a living, needs some, at least reference in the zoning code that tells them where to look when they want to know what they have to do with their sidewalk, and all of a sudden those diagrams are somewhere else.
When we remove the conflicting requirements from the zoning code, we can put a reference to the saldo, but I don't know that we need to remove those diagrams that are in there because.
Well, except anytime, same thing when you do a set of construction documents, anytime you have the same information twice, you run the risk of having a conflict if something changes and you forget to change it in both places.
No, I don't think we should repeat whatever we put in the saldo in the zoning. We should just reference it. I'm just talking about those drawings that are in near table 11 in the code. I'm not sure that because they don't have any width. Like if those are helpful where they are, I don't see any reason why we have to take them out or them. Well, we can keep talking about that.
So.
Okay, so
maybe the direction here is as Adam was trying to document it in the minutes, that maybe a way to approach this is to have a couple of different planting strip sidewalk combination types that only apply to places in the borough where we think over time improvements should be focused. Places like streets with curbs and no parking along them, particularly ones like Haverford, Montgomery, or Wynwood, where you get higher traffic speeds. Areas in the 5A and the 5B where we are trying to create pedestrian environments. Maybe the odd block like Rockland. And to have just a small number of typologies of sidewalk widths and planting strip widths, and in potentially 5A and 5B lighting requirements that work together to create. And I think Adam's point about considering where we might want to make sure planting strips are wide enough really to ensure the longevity of trees.
Right.
I mean, let me just finish. That, you know, that Adam was referring to Montgomery, I would say Wynwood could be a place like that. A street that's got huge old trees, a perfect place for specimen trees to be in the streetscape. So I think that's the package that might work. And then the rest of the borough, 4-foot sidewalks and continue the planting strips that exist. Okay, Jim, sorry.
There are a couple places in the borough where a sidewalk has gotten redeveloped and has a little jog around an existing tree.
Yeah.
Could we have something like that?
Whether that tree is there, still there or not.
See, if it's in the saldo,
yeah,
that could be an exception. I mean, a waiver. I'm not even sure how they did that for Price Avenue. Remember they did that when they did Price
right for the Methodist church.
Yeah, they did that.
But there are a couple on South Narberth too, like that I think the homeowner must have just done it on their own, you know, to accommodate existing trees. But
I suspect
it'd be
that's
nice
what
to
happened.
encourage that, or at least allow it to happen, you know, when you have that condition.
Okay, so, yeah, we'll check this one, Wetlands Road, more about that. This sounds like in a situation like this, you wouldn't want to see the addition of a planting strip stuck on Woodbine. I was just taking a look at what would it look like in a really sort of narrow, dense street, like maybe. Okay, so we just talked about this. Well, let me just say this is very helpful because I've been talking about this with Eric and Kevin and Michelle, and I feel like we just needed some guidance from you. Okay, on the topic of the planting strip, the current code in the zoning says that if the planting strip is at least 3 feet wide, any required street trees may be planted there at the discretion of the applicant, but that they are allowed to. And our landscape architects kind of flagged that as, you know, if it's just a 3-foot planting strip, you could plant a really small tree there, but you're not going to get the kind of shade trees, canopy trees that you usually would like along streets. So do you want to continue to allow street trees to be planted in a 3-foot planting strip is one question. And then assuming in some places we are requiring a wider planting strip, a 4, 5, 6-foot wide planting strip, should the applicant be required to plant trees there? Because they're not currently. They have the option of planting there, but they also can plant them the other side of the sidewalk if they so choose. That's other questions.
Well, are street trees required anywhere?
Street trees are required everywhere at a rate of some number. I have to look it up.
So is there a reason why we have to designate where?
No, not unless you want, well, do you want to allow them to be put in the planting strip if the planting strip is at least 3 feet wide? Or do you want to not allow them in the planting strip unless the planting strip is at least 4 or 5 feet wide?
You mean at the developer's or homeowner's option about which side to plant the tree on?
Currently, it's at the owner's option, the applicant's option.
Yeah.
If that seems fine, that's fine. Are there places where you'd really want to see the trees in the planting strip?
Well, there are places where, you know, that's where they're going to interfere with wires often.
Yeah, and then they just look like, really bad when they start
That's a good point.
cutting them back.
So you kind of want to evaluate that case by case, I think.
Right.
But I would say, yeah, if there's like an amenable, like if the applicant wants to have a tree on the planting strip side, we should allow them to do that, you know, even if it's creating a little jog around a new tree pit.
Could we, like, specify certain tree species that would be
The-
conducive?
Yeah, there is the Shade Tree Commission has a list like that, yeah.
Yeah, we're already involved in that. So it sounds like maybe this is okay, like it is, although I like your idea of sort of allowing a jog in the sidewalk, maintaining sidewalk width, but going around sort of a slightly larger tree pit. I think we can say something explicitly about that.
That's essentially what's happening here. I mean, it's sort of, you know, it's kind of like that. I'm not sure what purpose the sidewalk serves between the lamp post and the.
I was just thinking that, yeah.
It's a place to stop and talk.
Yeah.
Let through traffic through. It's a place to put a table. So
For your
cooling.
dog to do its business.
Yeah, new development, that tree pit does have like the more of a grade structure on it now, kind of like out front of 114.
I think the question about the top one is sort of, as Jim said, case by case.
Okay.
The bottom one, though, is that gets down to your typologies. Are there streets where we absolutely want trees in the planting strip?
Right. Like it sounded like maybe Montgomery was one of those places where, you know, in some places at least you want to require 6-foot wide planting strip.
I would say Montgomery, and if you go really look at Wynwood carefully, you would say Wynwood too. That's where all the trees are going. So the Street Tree Commission's been planting them there. That's where all the old trees are right now.
Can I ask kind of a,
Well, that's why you're planning new ones, right?
I don't know if this question really matters or not, but I mean, I love trees and I think we should plant them everywhere. I'm totally in support of that. But is the purpose of these requirements for trees biodiversity? Is it shade primarily, like exclusively? Because if it's something more along the lines of biodiversity, conservation, that kind of thing, natural habitat, animal habitat, you know, maybe there could be an option for some kind of like a butterfly garden, or, you know, like those kinds of, you see Refugia doing these, like the gardens that attract bees, like that kind of thing. Not that we want bees on the sidewalk, but, you know, that kind of thing. I don't know. Depending on the, you know, primary purpose.
Well, trees collect rain. I think that's one of them, and provide a lot of oxygen,
Yeah.
clean the air.
Yeah.
I don't think a butterfly garden does any of that.
Jen, I can't tell you how many people I've said that the place to look for that is in the landscaping ordinance. That, you know, and I think that's a good idea. I just don't think it's here in the South.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I mean, I think the rules we have about buffers and things like that could be expanded to include, you know, requirements for a portion of your yard to be used for habitat, or, you know, it's incredible how often the Borough Council asks us about density bonuses, like for green buildings. I'd like to think about a reward system for getting rid of lawns. You know, I mean, so I think it's a great topic. It's just not part
And
of the
replacing, and I mean, I wouldn't want to, the reason I just brought that up is I thought, well, if they have an option to not have a tree, then it's just going to be one more concrete paver. But rather than that, maybe there's an option, you could do a tree, or you could do a, you know, low-lying something or another.
Well,
Right, concrete pavers currently are not allowed in the planting strip. These are pictures from, you know, downtown where that's what's there, but it's not currently what's permitted. But in certain districts, it might be what you'd want, or you know, it could be up to 50% of the planting strip area in the 5A district, maybe brick or stone or utilities or parking meters or other things like that. That's not currently written in your code, but I guess I'm asking, would you like me to include that here? And if so, only for the 5A or 5B?
you're talking about paving and planting strips.
Right, like street furniture, paving. A lot of downtown or commercial districts have sort of fancy paving. They'll have regular sidewalk, and then they'll have some sort of brick or cobblestone in between street trees. Things like that. Is that something you want to allow for, or allow some amount of?
I was going to point out that you know where Green Drop is?
Yes.
They were required to create that planting strip, and they redeveloped that property, but they filled the planting strip with stone on top of like a landscaping tarp, and you know now there are weeds poking up through it. It looks awful. I'm not sure how they were allowed to get away with that, or maybe nobody enforced it at the time, but we should not be allowing that kind of, you know.
We'll have to write it better than that.
Yeah, good point.
So that sounds like it's worth exploring, Chloe.
Okay.
And I think the question that Jen is raising is a question of the interaction between this and the landscape ordinance.
Yes. Which is important and needs to be handled.
Which is so old, I think it was written on a manual typewriter. I swear.
I've seen, that was the first copy I had before it was codified.
I have a copy of it. Yeah, it was written on a manual typewriter.
Nothing wrong with
like mimeographed. All right, can we move on to another topic?
Yes, we can. I've really been waiting to talk about that for a long time. So
Yes,
that
we have.
was great. Okay, let's move to the Transportation Impact Study, which is Article 7.
Right, so we don't have anything about this now.
Right.
So can you explain your thinking about when and why we would ask for a transportation impact study and what it would accomplish?
You can start, Eric, and I will chime in probably.
Okay. You're correct. So your current code does not have very clear language on requirement of a traffic impact study. And but just a broad overview, what the study is an evaluation of what's the impact of a development is going to have on the transportation system of that. Traditionally, you think of cars, but that does also include pedestrians, that's bikes, and pedestrians walking around. So I guess there's a few aspects to it. What the section that's in this model code now is, it's kind of formed, it could definitely be worked out a little bit more, but I think there's two. The first step is, at what threshold development do we want this to require this full type of study? And then the main objectives that you're going to get out of that study. So the first being the threshold. So, well, the way the study is conducted all goes back to PennDOT has a publication of just 282, which is basically it's the standard, what needs to be done, how it's done, how you assess the impacts, and go through the procedure. In there, it has thresholds that are much higher than what it is that would be applicable to your borough. So I think in this version, I think the first stab at it was like, you have a certain number of residential units, you have a certain square footage of commercial property. And I think this is saying 40.
Yeah, I'll share that too,
Yeah.
so you can see.
So it's how much traffic is going to be generated by a property, how big that property is. So setting that threshold is, I think, a good topic. And thinking of what development has come in, what would have triggered it, how much do we want it triggered? Do we want the little development? Let's say 100 Forest, which is a few thousand square feet of retail and 8 apartment units. Do we want it to be triggered? We have like a 114 Forest, which was 52 residential units, or somewhere in between. So I think the standard that we're working off right now, which is up for discussion, is 40 is the amount of traffic. So it's 40 trips generated peak hour. So peak hour is when people are going to work in the morning, coming home at night. Right now, if that's 40 trips, that's, to think of as a magnitude, that's like one house is one peak hour trip. So that would be like 40 houses or units. Or a certain threshold of commercial space. So like that one is 30,000 square feet. So,
Real quick question. Does the applicant have a trip generation rate that they would, how do we know if it's 40 trips in the peak hour?
so that gets done, that they have to do that's a whole engineering study. So they need to,
But so they have to do the study to know if they have to do a transportation impact study? I mean, how do they know that they're meeting the criteria?
so I guess there's a few ways of looking at it. It's either, if one of the criteria, let's say, is a certain number of residential units, you do or do not make it. It's a certain threshold of commercial space, that's one. The chip generation, that kind of data, that's when you start getting to like the engineering level. There are recognized trip generation ITS sheets that basically are the national standard, and you have a certain use, like you have a movie theater generates this many trips, and that's more or less, that's how that you would. I mean, and it could even be a situation where they come and say, no, we don't meet it, but we disagree. This is being reviewed by the borough's professionals. Well, no, actually, you do meet it, and you're going to have to provide the study.
So those trip generation factors, it's been about 2 years or 3 years since I've looked at them.
Yeah.
Do those just count vehicular trips or all trips, all modes?
So that particular metric is, that line right there would be vehicles. Now, to kind of expand into that discussion, the standard when when you're completing a traffic impact study does require the collection of information on the amount of pedestrians, bicycles, and vehicles. It requires an analysis of all modes of transportation.
That's part B.
That part B.
Yeah,
that threshold right there would not be triggered. As that's written right now, pedestrian bikes aren't going to trigger that threshold.
That's not what it says, just to be clear. It says trips. It doesn't say vehicular trips or automobile trips.
You're right.
Which makes more sense to me.
Which could, all right, so, okay, that might be.
I mean, it might actually make more sense because the
Yeah.
ITS manual is going to say so-and-so trips from a movie theater, but they mostly count in suburban areas where everyone is driving.
Right.
But I think ITS, does it say vehicular trips or is it a trip generation rate based on land use? So that they're not necessarily assigning them to mode,
Right,
Yeah,
then that's the second step is mode choice.
right.
okay.
I don't know, but I mean, I just.
Yeah, no,
It's been a couple of years since looking. I seem to recall it was either parking generation or trip generation they were learning was wildly off compared to real experience in transit-oriented areas.
I mean, I think you mentioned the movie theater, and right there, it's like a typical movie theater generates, a movie that seats 100 people might have, 50 cars. But I don't think that our movie theater seems to generate 50 cars. So it's unusual in that respect. But you might say, if it's based on trips, you would have to evaluate it.
Right.
And then the finding would be mode specific.
So there's a good point. I want to look into that one. So I guess a good question for this portion of it. Think of the developments that we've seen recently and project into the future. What do you want? I guess it's, do we only want a study that goes, we're going to make a written applicant go into a very in-depth analysis for the large developments, for the medium-sized developments, the small ones, or, and I was talking to my colleague about this, or, and this would have to be kind of reviewed by solicitor, or is it kind of by default, all development has to provide a study?
So I thought part of the issue too was whether you wanted a curb cut on like an arterial. So I know they needed a highway occupancy permit from PennDOT, on a state road, but that is also part of the issue beyond just trip generation was like, I thought the issue of circulation on sites.
Yeah, I mean, Adam was right. The real question is not, I mean, I know the threshold is the first logical question, but the most important question for us is like, what's the end game here? Right? And I would say the end game is not so much the number of vehicles. I mean, I think for us, the concerns have tended to be about safety. And I mean, I know more vehicles, there might be a relationship between more traffic and safety. But I think if you look at the 3 Elmwood, the big question is having more vehicles around here going to stress out a pedestrian circulation? Or can we do things to balance out, if we're going to be adding more traffic, probably can be handled, except for the concerns about the right turn lane. But can we balance that out with things that will actually make it safer for pedestrians here, right? I mean, like one of the best things about Forest Avenue, they put a stop sign there now. They left it up. That's great.
Yeah, that was like during construction that we started, when the construction trailer was there, it went up, and now that we're all done, they asked us, do we just want to take it down, and went, No.
That's like a meaningful improvement.
No, we're not. The end conclusion was, no, actually, we like it.
Yeah.
Like
or doing something where you put a textured crosswalk in, or things that improve the multimodal functioning.
So,
that's the end game, I think, for Norbert. Like, it's not like, oh, can we handle 10 more cars at a traffic light in a peak hour?
Well, so here, I think, I'll let you go a second.
Go ahead.
I think the publication, this is PennDOT publication 283, which is what, as an engineer reviewing that's like the procedural and how everything is done that we rely on, that has the requirement that pedestrians, bikes, all of that is counted, all of that's considered. So it gives us the flexibility to be able to enforce and develop and study as we want it. Then the language, I think, as it is now, can be adjusted and modified to fit the end goal that you're looking to achieve, which is a more holistic approach.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, I think that in terms of what you can ask for in existing conditions and how the proposed development will change those conditions in the future is very broad. You can ask about pedestrian, bicycle, and vehicle counts. That Pub 282 asks about school buses and school bus stops, transit vehicles that go by at a number of nearby intersections. You can gather a lot of data. Whatever threshold you include there, you can ask for a lot of information about what's currently happening. I did ask some of our transportation planners about, can you ask them to sit at an intersection and count how many cars are rolling through the stop sign versus stopping? And they said, I think you could ask about that. I mean, if that's what you want to know about the intersections nearby. So you can ask for a lot, you can gather a lot of information, request a lot of information. What you can require that an applicant do to mitigate problems is a little thornier. And development is not usually kind of a tit for tat situation, but I feel like I see that more with transportation impact studies, where they may identify some problem that they're not technically required to fix, but they need something else for their development. And there's just room for this conversation saying, look, we know you need a waiver on your sidewalk width here, but would you please improve this crosswalk? Because it would really be a big benefit to the borough. And there's situations in which having a lot of existing conditions data can help you. If nothing else, it's information for the borough to have, but maybe there's a situation in which you can get some improvement. The kind of legislation that allows requesting improvements is all based on the dropping level of service for vehicle delay at an intersection. So there's...
It's not really relevant.
That's not what you want to deal with, and not the kind of issues that you're concerned with in the borough. But I think it's beneficial to write it as like, we'd like all this data, please. We'd like to know how your development is going to impact these conditions in the future, what's going to change based on this development condition. And then we want to have a conversation with you about it. Like that's kind of, I think, what you're going to get about this sort of big picture thinking. And we can, we can talk more, Eric and I, about like, well, how much can we ask them to mitigate this, and probably loop in your solicitor about like improving conditions for bicycles, pedestrians, transit riders, school bus riders. But if nothing else, you'll have the information and the ability to have that conversation about it.
Let me ask if there's an analogy here. I remember talking to Adam, who's developing the Albrecht site. He was a little, bemused and irritated that, like, because he was touching one corner of that intersection, because it's a state highway, PennDOT was going to require him to improve all four corners.
That's the ADA requirement. If you touch one side of a ramp, you must do the other side of the ramp. But sure, PennDOT sure finds a way to get things improved if they want, off-site. So is that an analogy for us? Like, you're building on a corner, you're fixing the corner, so let's look at that whole intersection there. Maybe you improve the sidewalks all around. Like, that would have been nice to ask 114 Forest, is there a way you can do some intersection improvements here, So, I know state law, we have to, but it seems like sometimes, there's little openings like that maybe we can take advantage of. I don't know. Well, if you're gathering the data, so let's say this new apartment building, clearly you're generating pedestrian traffic. Okay, what destinations are they going to? They're walking through this intersection down this way. Like, that's the pedestrian pathways that are leading out there. So I guess it gives you at least you have the data to then have that discussion.
Right. So that's the spirit of it.
Is there a relationship between, I mean, it's going to sound rhetorical, but I don't know how to ask the question. But between threshold and speed, and I recall 3 Youngwood, the question of speed, Jim Cornell was adamant that that speed limit had to come down for safety reasons. It's you know, there's a lot of people there, and, you know, the cars are not following the speed limit signs and all these kinds of things. Where does speed limit fall into this whole picture?
So I guess kind of one of the things to keep in mind with, you know, even if you're doing this traffic impact studies, like the limitations that you can even get to in these mitigations. So, you know, something like a vehicle rolling through a stop sign or cars not following a speed limit, it actually comes down, that ends up being, it's like an enforcement type issue of traffic laws. So like, you know, a development in and itself is not necessarily going to change like the speed limit of a road. There's only not really much they can do to stop a car from rolling through an intersection. Now that being said, there are ways that you can, and here's how it can tie into a development. The way a property and how development along a street interacts with the street frontage makes a big difference. So when the street, like your zoning code wants a building, you want that street wall, you want the buildings up closer to the road, parking towards the back. That makes roads feel narrower, that makes cars slow down and behave better. So like it's that type of stuff. So do trees. Like that,
trees right against the curb.
So like the stuff that you're doing to improve your land development anyway, and the way your streets can have a benefit to help speeding and make drivers behave better. But there is you can't quite get everything.
Yeah.
The traffic impact study itself can't quite get to those aspects.
Well, sure, but there are things that help. Like if rolling through stop signs is an issue, then redesigning the intersection to make it clear, you know, where the stop bar is or where the side crosswalk is, adjusting the stop sign, so you know that could help. Putting in a neck down,
right?
That could help,
right?
You know, there are physical
the surface of the pavement.
Yeah, there are physical things you can do.
And actually, the code actually does have a whole section now on crosswalks in it with various organization types and that kind of stuff.
So, like, if you're able to do this study and demonstrate that, like, half the people roll through the intersection, so you know you're building your house, you're building there in a pedestrian zone, but did you know that half the people actually don't even stop here? So maybe you should mitigate that with your development by improving this intersection so your residents will be safer. Yeah, I mean that's the link we're looking for, right? You know, fix the crosswalks, put in paving. I don't know.
But that's at a different scale, right? I mean, this is not on an applicant to improve that condition.
Oh no, that's what I'm saying. That's the argument you make to the applicant. You're
right.
You're demonstrating you're building in a place where there's kind of flaws in the circulation system that are, by building there, you're going to exacerbate the dangers that occur. I mean, it's an argument we were making about 3 Elmwood. You know, so what are you going to do to mitigate that? I mean, I guess I don't think you can ask an applicant to change a speed limit because that's not there. But they can, I think, be asked to make improvements to intersections and things that will create a generally safer atmosphere. So it's less about throughput and capacity, and it's more about the taming of the volume. So anyway, I think that's the spirit of what we're looking for.
Is it possible to know what thresholds other municipalities?
So I did look into that. So the most equivalent one to you would be, I'm familiar with the Swarthmore, and I looked up their threshold. So applicants of any residential subdivision or land development proposed that contains 20 or more dwelling units or for any non-residential land development shall prepare and submit a traffic impact study.
Any commercial?
Any non-residential or residential with 20 units.
So would non-residential mean mixed use?
that would be a non,
Yeah.
that's commercial space in it.
Is it possible to delineate different levels of analysis, like?
So there's a scoping study that, they would, if they're required to do a transportation impact study, they'd have to sit down with, the borough engineer and other important people like that to decide what exactly this transportation impact study should cover. Municipal scoping meeting, and then it says if the scoping meeting is not held, the applicant shall at minimum, there's a verb here, the 3 intersections of a local street with an arterial or urban collector street that are closest to the proposed development. So they have to look at whatever they're developing on intersects with Haverford, Wynwood, or Montgomery, the 3 closest locations. But there's a conversation that happens with the
At the beginning of the study.
at the beginning, it's ideally to decide what has to be studied exactly, what they have to do. And maybe that's part of that where, it's a really small development, but it includes some commercial, or it's just barely 20 residential units. I'm like, okay, well, look at this intersection that's right here by your development, or, in the direction of the train station from your 20 unit development where some people will be walking for sure.
Yeah, I mean, just to show you, the micro scale, I think the 230 Haverford, that was the Rickland site. If it is surprising to me how many people just kind of barrel through that pedestrian crosswalk there, right in front of their building.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing where, the planning of that site might help improve that condition. In terms of the location of the crosswalk or the way the parking is arranged on the street, or I don't know, but that's the kind of micro.
Yeah, in Architecture 101, you learn that in a building, when you need to put a sign on something to tell people where to go or what to do, your architecture has basically failed. That you need to, create that. You need to design the space so that you don't need a sign with an arrow on it telling them where to go.
I missed that lecture.
But it seems like, that crosswalk situation is kind of like that because it is obscured by cars and
I think it is analogous to street design in some ways that in an ideal world, you want your street design to have everybody going the right speed and being safe and deferring to pedestrians, and that the street design just tells you that when you're moving through it. Yeah.
Well, do you have good guidance there?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Another stab at that?
It's late, it's 9:45. So I'm wondering whether we should put a pause on this and regroup at some date in the future. Is there anything really, really important?
And I could say something briefly about lighting. It already came up. Or we could say it. Your zoning code does say something about lighting. It says that luminaires shall not be mounted in excess of 14 feet above finished grade of the surface being illuminated. But it doesn't say how many lights you have to put in or where you should put them. So we've put in the draft saldo that on urban collector and arterial roadways, pedestrian-oriented lighting shall be provided between the curb and the sidewalk, but maybe at a maximum spacing of 60 feet. So that at least once every 60 feet, there has to be some kind of pedestrian light. Maybe we need to say, like, if your frontage is less than 60 feet, you have to have at least one.
Where did you get 60 feet from? Where did you get 60 feet?
No, I copied it from some other ordinance somewhere.
I suspect
probably.
what that is probably 60 feet on each side of the road, like if you probably here to here.
No, I think
No?
the idea was 60 feet along one side.
Okay.
And then it says lighting shall be installed on both sides of the street. And then
Arterials and collectors, was it, or?
arterials and collectors. So that's only Wynwood, Haverford, and Montgomery. And our staff level conversation was that about, maybe we don't want lighting all along all of the residential streets necessarily. There already are street lights that are taller at all intersections.
a lot.
Most intersections?
Yeah, I don't think you want and I don't think that was your concern. I think it's the main, the busy roads.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is what you have, I mean, the downtown district, you
It's
have.
like, it's the
pedestrian lights.
juxtaposition of scale of the speed of the cars and the people who are walking in a totally different quality of life.
Right.
So, and there was also a question about how this interacts with the zoning ordinance. The zoning ordinance basically just says that lighting can't be more than 14 feet high. So it has to be, that's relatively pedestrian scaled, although it could be a little bit lower. And so then adding it to the saldo would be about this pedestrian oriented light spacing and then street lights. This is what we discussed staff level. So I don't know if this
We have
looks-
the tall streetlights downtown too.
Those are about the 14-foot tall. You mean on the pole, the Cobra heads? At the intersections, I believe. You have the pole mounted, I think there's a handful.
I would just check that 60 feet and find out whether that's too much for a pedestrian district, whether they should be closer.
Probably depends on the height of the fixture.
Yeah.
doesn't it?
Right.
Right, it's not going to illuminate every inch of sidewalk at 60 feet apart. So that kind of depends on your goals too.
So I'm looking, you're downtown, you guys have the decorative lights, but then like the intersection of Norbert and Haverford has the Cobra head.
Why would we have any lighting requirements in the zoning?
The zoning also has sections that have to do with lights have to be angled down no more than so many foot candles on the residential property, those types of requirements.
But I think it would be fine to move all of that to Saldo if you want.
Well, the only, it gets back to what I was telling Dave, sometimes zoning applies to more projects than the saldo does. So if you put it in the saldo, then it wouldn't apply to single family houses, right?
Well, the benefit of like especially in the zoning sections where it has about like intensities at the property lines and all that, that's an enforceable section that can be used for
Right.
just regulating properties.
Right.
This section in the zoning, it says the illumination projected from any use shall not exceed 0.2 foot candles. So that section, there might be a good reason to keep that in the zoning. You don't want someone randomly putting up an
That's the third
excessively
reason
bright
why
light
it
that's
might be
disturbing the neighbors.
They're
You have some
enforceable down the road.
ability to
Okay.
work. Although sometimes that's covered in a nuisance ordinance.
All right, I think we have to call it quits.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
This was very helpful to us in terms of trying to keep moving with this.
So
Have these discussions on these important issues.
we'll have to coordinate with the staff about how we move forward. We do, just as you know, we don't have a meeting in August. We'll probably have a lot of development reviews in July. We're gonna have a very busy agenda for the rest of the year. That's not to mention any new zoning issues we want to look at, which we tried to start. So I don't know what the answer to that is now. It may mean we have to try to have extra meetings at some point, but it's clear there's a lot more ground for us to cover as well in this. So we'll just have to talk to the rest staff about how fast and when they'd like to manage this. But it may not be until September that we can talk about this again. So if that's an issue, that's...
Right. Well, I mean, I wonder if we could consider just biting off that sidewalk and planting strip piece of it again.
I don't know, because in July, it's possible we'll be hearing 146 Marion. It's possible the Montgomery Avenue will be back.
Yeah. Okay.
So it all depends on how fast those applications move. But I think that's a good thought, is to prioritize the sections you want to bring back.
Right, and what might need to be discussed as a group.
Yeah.
And what can be resolved with staff level addressing certain specific comments. That feels like the biggest thing that might need to come back here, so that there's a consensus on what we really want in terms of sidewalks and planting strips and how to address it in the code. We'll work on that, and when the right time comes to bring it back, we'll be ready.
Okay. All right. Next time of business, motion to adjourn. Unless there's anything else. Who would like to make a motion to adjourn? Mr. Spear makes a motion to adjourn. Whoever makes the motion to adjourn gets to leave first.
I don't think so.
Second for the motion to adjourn. It is 9. Heidi, that's Heidi. Heidi got her vote in there. So it's 9:52. All in favor of adjourning? Aye. Thank you very much. All right. Well.